And hey there, it is Tom Jordan. Got a, special election edition of Tom Jordan Live. We have a number of states that are closing right now. Election night 2024. We're going to be broadcasting from 8 p.m. until midnight tonight. Polls are now officially closed in many different states on the East Coast and also mostly in the Eastern time zone. Some have already closed at 6 o'clock this evening, Eastern time. Many of them closed at 7 o'clock. So when you look around, in about 30 minutes now, we'll have the state of Arkansas is going to close as well. But we are primarily looking at the battleground states tonight on this election night 2024. And I just want to go through a few states that have already been called by some of the media outlets. Illinois has been called for a Kamala Harris. Indiana earlier tonight called for Donald Trump with 62% to Kamala Harris's 36%. Kentucky, Donald Trump 65 to Kamala Harris's 33. Missouri right now being called for Donald Trump. West Virginia as well, a state we'll be watching when it comes to the Senate race. Of course, with Joe Manchin retiring his seat in West Virginia, that's another one that looks like favorable to the Republicans for the Senate. And Vermont is being called for a Kamala Harris, expected as well, 68% to Donald Trump's 28%. The ones that we are going to be looking at are these 7 battleground states. And 4 of them have pretty much wrapped up. Michigan still technically will be open until 9 o'clock Eastern time because 4 of the counties in the state of Michigan are actually technically in the central time zone. But by and large, most of the counties in the state of Michigan have wrapped up their voting. We'll be watching that as well as we look at these 7 battleground states tonight. And we will be kind of analyzing the potential pathways to victory for both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Remember, 270 electoral votes is what is needed. And the states that are pretty important, of course, Pennsylvania, 19 electoral votes at stake in Pennsylvania. Kamala Harris really desperately needs that state if she's going to have a clear pathway. Donald Trump needs that, but if he doesn't get Pennsylvania, he has a number of other scenarios he can get into. Right now, we want to get into the state of Michigan. Joining me this hour to discuss the returns, Nolan Finley, the editorial page director for the Detroit News, and Dennis Darnoy is the founder of Densar Consulting. Both of the gentlemen, first guests up tonight on this election night. Nolan is with us right now. So, Nolan, we'll start with you. And I want to talk to you. Welcome to the program. Nice to have you, by the way.
No, it's good to be here, Tom. Thank you.
It's a crazy election season, and I think one of the craziest that I have seen ever in terms of the national race. There was another crazy election back in 2013 when it came to the Detroit mayoral race, and there was one debate where they had, I think, 35 different candidates. You were on a panel with Stephen Henderson. I think Debbie Dingell was on that panel, if you remember that debate, and I was
I do.
moderating it. But since then, this is about as crazy as they get. I want to first talk about something you just wrote about. You talked about wagering on the elections. You wrote this column yesterday, and it's very intriguing to a lot of folks when you look at the potential results of this election based on how
Hmm.
people are betting in relation to the election. But you're arguing that
Yep.
this is kind of a dangerous thing to do for our democracy.
Well, yeah, I think there's some things that should not be made into a sport or made into a game. I mean, elections aren't DraftKings, for goodness sake. We cheapen them by, allowing people to make bets or raise the possibility of election meddling if you get enough money betted that it's in somebody's interest to try to skew the outcome. And some of these sites take up to $100 million bets. Well, you get a group of those combined together, and you raise that possibility that it would that temptation to actually try to affect the outcome so that you could cash in on your bet.
Do you think that, yeah, I'm glad you wrote about this because I agree with you. This is a more serious issue than a lot of people might realize. And
Yeah.
it's kind of fun to look at in terms of comparing
Yeah.
the betting that has taken place to the polls that are out there. And if you just look at the bets, it's like 60% Donald Trump to Kamala Harris's 40%. It's thereabouts.
Yeah.
It doesn't match the polling that is going on and hasn't for the
No.
entirety, I think, of this, general election season. But the fact that
No.
it can skew the potential outcome of this, do you think,
Yeah.
based on what you've written and the kind of research you've done, that eventually there will be laws put in place to prevent this from happening? Everyone's worried about election integrity and those
Yeah, I
types of
think so. I
things.
I think there'll be some attempts at regulating this, as there should be. You know, I'm a pretty much free market person. I don't believe the government should uh, interfere in a whole lot of areas. But I think when it comes to the sanctity of elections, we should do whatever it takes to protect them. Unfortunately, in Michigan and some other places, we haven't done everything it takes to secure our elections and restore confidence in our elections.
Well, if anything, and you wrote about this as well, we've done the opposite. And I know
Right.
that you're a Republican, you are a conservative, but you're no fan of Donald Trump and especially his
No.
claims of that 2020 was rigged. But the Democratic Party and this particular Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson, hasn't done anything to fix that or to instill confidence in voters other
No.
than to say if you talk about this, we're going to mark you as someone who's
Right.
spreading disinformation. But the laws,
Right.
can you go through the laws that have been put in place under her
Well, I
basically
mean, just
leadership?
I think one of a couple of the most egregious issues in this campaign, there's still 500,000 more people on the voter rolls than there are people of voting age in Michigan. So that means there's a lot of people who shouldn't be voting who are ineligible to vote. And I don't know if they're voting or not, but they're on the rolls. And as long as they're on the rolls, there's an opening for fraud. And Jocelyn Benson hasn't done enough to bring those rolls up to date. She's lagged most of the other states in the nation in producing legitimate voter rolls. One of the problems with that is if you once request an absentee ballot, you keep getting those absentee ballots until you're taken off the
Mm,
voter rolls, until you're
right,
ruled
right.
ineligible. And so that's an opening for fraud. This last minute registration, same day registration. Uh, Previously, if you registered to vote within 14 days of the election, your name got put on a list, your registration got put on a list, and your ballot was held until your status could be verified because there is a process for working with the Social Security Administration to make sure you're eligible to register to vote, that you are a U.S. citizen. And there's something like 34,000 names this cycle that don't match the federal records, people who have registered to vote don't match the federal records. It's another opening for fraud. If it's a close election, you could say that there was a Jocelyn Benson effect, and that she kept Robert F. Kennedy on the ballot, even though he has to be taken off and wasn't a candidate. And you assume most of the votes he peels away will come from Donald Trump. So she did that explicitly to benefit Kamala Harris. She's been
Hmm.
an extremely partisan Secretary of State, and that does erode trust in the election system.
Most partisan I've ever seen in my lifetime. And she did promise that she wouldn't be that way, yet she's campaigning with Kamala Harris and these other Democrats and
And
doing
giving
these
money to
very things.
Democratic
I don't
candidates.
understand why, she is doing these things. Like, for example, I mean, I get the RFK Jr. thing and the Cornell West thing as well, opposite outcomes based on her intention to benefit at the time Joe Biden and now Kamala
Yeah.
Harris. But when it comes to, like, for example, you brought up same day registration. To me, that's a major issue. And I think today, the
Should be.
last number I looked, there were about 9,600 same day registrations that took place today in the state of Michigan. There's no way you can properly verify those individuals, is there?
Well, and you can, and they will all be allowed to vote, or were allowed to vote, without their registrations being verified. And if in a few weeks from now their registrations come back and they say you weren't eligible to vote, there is no remedy to that. You can't subtract their vote. So, there's no remedy.
Yeah, and there's no way to find out because once the ballot is cast, that voter is now anonymous. So we saw the recent situation where a Chinese national University of Michigan student was
Yeah,
not a U.S. citizen, is not a U.S. citizen, but somehow was allowed to register to vote and then cast his ballot. And by the time he did that, they figured out this guy's not eligible. But it's too late at that point because of
it
new
is, and
laws that have been.
there
Go
are
ahead.
other students right now lined up at Michigan State University, lined up at U of M, who will register to vote today, and we have no idea if they've already filled out an early voting ballot for home their home states. If they're eligible to vote, if they're U.S. citizens, we have no way to know that, and won't know until after the election's over, when it's too late to do anything about it.
Yeah. It's a strategy. I think she used that last time around as well. 2020, the election verification. She threw. I mean, sorry, the signature verification. She threw that out the window. The Supreme Court ruled after the election that that was unconstitutional. It was illegal. But by that time, it's too late.
Yeah,
I know you're watching the state of Michigan closely, and there's different counties that seem to be a bellwether of how the rest of the state is going to go. We look at like Saginaw County, that seems to be
yeah,
one of the, because they have been, I think that county, they voted with the winning candidate in every election since Barack Obama's first run for office back in 2008.
right.
And then there's Grand Traverse County, that both the Trump and the Harris campaigns have gone up there to these rural communities multiple times, these rural hotbeds of political ideologies. How are you feeling about like Saginaw and Grand Traverse?
I don't know. I think this is going to be razor thin election in Michigan. Exit polls right now are showing Harris with a pretty good lead, but same day voting hasn't been accounted for in those exit polls. It's going to be close here. There's the polls have been telling us all along, and there's no reason to believe they won't be. I do think it's very possible we could end up with a split verdict here, with one party winning the presidency and the other winning the U.S. Senate race. But we're still a ways to go before we can predict that, Tom.
Yeah, that's a tight race as well. We got Mike Rogers, Alyssa Slotkin giving up her seventh congressional seat to run for this current Senate seat. Mike Rogers
Yeah.
used to hold that seventh congressional district seat a number of years back, and they're going head to head. And this is a very close race. How do you see this playing out here? I mean, Mike Rogers, in my view, has been able to refute some of Alyssa Slotkin's claims far better than her previous opponents, like Paul Young, Mike Bishop tried, and Tom Barrett in the previous congressional race. How do you think they're doing, respectively?
I think Mike Rogers has had a good ground game. I think he's done everything he can do. He was outspent 10-1. She has raised an ungodly amount of money from who knows where. I don't believe it's from. She raised 16, $17 million from mom and pop donors. But it's a huge spending race. He's been at the disadvantage, the financial disadvantage. I don't know.
Yeah. It's the latest. I think is Slotkin up by 2 in the polls, but that's an average, and that's a big mix. Latest polls, there's the two that came out I think yesterday. One shows Mike Rogers up by 2, the other shows Alyssa Slotkin up by 2. So you're right. It's kind of a hit and mix thing. I do wonder if you remember back in 2020, which of course you do, that presidential race 4 years ago. There was a lot of talk about energy, and we're going to ban fossil fuels, and we're going to put in renewable energy as the go-to, and everyone was big on electric vehicle mandates and that kind of thing, including Alyssa Slotkin. Now, EVs are not so popular anymore. Neither are the renewable energy mandates that have been put in place. And you're seeing Alyssa Slotkin, who voted for those types of things, pulling back on it. And Mike Rogers is doubling down that we need energy independence. How much do you think that is an issue in this race when you compare it to, it's related to the economy, but you factor in illegal immigration, which suddenly has become a big issue in the state of Michigan. What do you think are
Yeah.
some of the top 2 or 3 issues?
Well, I think that's it. Inflation, immigration, crime to a lesser degree here. Uh, Abortion ranks well down the list, even though that's what Democrats wanted to focus on in this campaign. And if they end up losing the Michigan House, it will be because they put a bad bet on abortion again this year. And I don't think it's playing as well as it has in years
I think most
past.
people realize abortion has kind of been decided by the states, and
So it
certainly
is.
that's the case in the state of Michigan. We're probably the most aggressive when it comes to pro-abortion laws
Oh,
now
my
that we are
goodness.
anyone else in the country.
Well, there are no
What do you
limits, really.
what do you think about this issue with the seventh congressional race? Now that Slotkin has given that up, we've got Tom Barrett in there against Curtis Hertel.
that'll be the closest in the state, I think. Um, I think that's anybody's bet now. I think the top of the ticket will impact that. It's a Republican-drawn district. Uh, there were Tom Barrett ran a good campaign against Curtis Hertel, the Democrat. I think it'll be very close. Uh, if there's a chance for a Republican pickup in this state, I think that's it.
Yeah. What do you think about, Dan Kildee, a long time, well, the Kildee
Yeah,
family name has been a long time holder of that seat in the 8th Congressional District, where it is now near Flint. Democratic stronghold in that sense in the House, but it seems to be not as close to the 7th. But so you've got now Paul Young, who had run previously against Dan Kildee, going at that
yeah.
same seat again against McDonald Rivet. How do you foresee that race?
I don't think Young had the resources that she's had in this race. It's a closely drawn district. It's been Democratic for a long time.
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to flip.
Okay. Well, I'd like to get your thoughts, generally speaking. I know, and listen, I've read your stuff for a very, very long time. I respect you, and that's why I very much respect when you say, okay, when Nolan Finley says there is an issue with election integrity in the state of Michigan, it must be it's real, because I know you've been pushing
Thank you.
back against the rhetoric from Donald Trump. The Detroit News, and you guys made a decision not to endorse anybody for that particular race. You've kind of gone down the list of a lot of Republican endorsements. Donald Trump, no, and I remember I believe you wrote that editorial on it. Maybe it was a team effort. One of the things you said in there is that you largely agree with a lot of his policies. You just don't think he has the character to lead this country. Why not?
He doesn't. I think we saw that on January 6, 2021. That was despicable. And I can remember watching that and thinking, I could not believe a United States president was behaving in that manner. To me, on that moment, he forfeited any right to represent the American people ever again.
But what about, the argument would be, and you've heard this argument time and again, okay, but his policies are good for this country. Kamala Harris's policies
Oh,
and Joe Biden's are ruining the foundations, some would argue, of
oh,
the United States of America, including an attempt to potentially get rid of this separation of powers and these three branches of government and centralizing power. How do you make that argument when you're confronted with that argument on the other side?
well, they're both bad. I mean, and Donald Trump's policies, yeah, I've agreed with some of them, but if he wins and goes through with this tariff regime, you haven't seen inflation like you're going to see then. Yeah, he's had some good policies, and the Biden administration has had disastrous policies, which is why we didn't endorse either one of them. But we've been pretending here that this election is about choosing between two different directions for America. America's only headed in one direction, no matter who wins, and that's straight to hell, unless somebody gets a hold of the debt and deficits and starts imposing some measure of fiscal discipline on our economy.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people say, politics is downstream from the culture, and our culture doesn't seem so good as of late. So maybe this is just being
No,
reflected in the political dynamic in this country. Well, listen, I really love reading your stuff. You're always a
appreciate
privilege to
it.
talk to, and I can't thank you enough for coming on. It's Nolan Finley with the Detroit News, the editorial page director. Nolan, good to see you. Take care.
Good to see you, Tom. Glad you're enjoying this new format.
Yeah, thanks. It's fun. It's a lot of fun. It is new. So appreciate it very much. We'll talk soon. Nolan Finley with the Detroit News. All right, I want to go through something here because there's, again, I want to remind you what states have already been called. And this is with Fox News as I'm getting the map updated here. But we have Illinois right now, as expected, going to Kamala Harris. And these are all expected. By the way, I'm just giving you an update of where it is right now. Missouri right now for Donald Trump. Oklahoma for Donald Trump. Mississippi for Donald Trump, pretty good margin, 53 to 45. Alabama, Donald Trump. Tennessee is for Donald Trump, a big margin, 76 to 23. So that's Tennessee. Kentucky as well. Trump over Harris, about 62% to Kamala Harris's 37%. West Virginia, as expected, going to Donald Trump as well. And the state of Florida with the 30 electoral votes, Donald Trump. South Carolina, again expected Donald Trump. All right, now we're going to Maryland, which is now for Kamala Harris. Right now, they have 10 electoral votes in the state of Maryland. Again, it's a liberal state, as is New Jersey. New Jersey right now is going for Kamala Harris. Not as tight as some other ones, but a 54 to 45 Kamala Harris over Donald Trump. Connecticut, 64 Kamala Harris to 34 for Donald Trump. And in Vermont, it's 67 for Kamala Harris, 30 for Donald Trump. All right, the big ones we're looking at, of course, are these 7 battleground states. This is what we're really going to be paying attention to tonight a lot. Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Nevada. So I'm going to play some games here. I'm going to try to figure out which state is going to go where. Again, you need 270 to win. As it stands right now, with the states that we know are going to Kamala versus Donald Trump, Donald Trump has 219, pretty much in the bag. Kamala Harris has 226. Remember, this is on the way to 270. You're seeing the battleground states right there. Since we have Georgia up there for these presidential election results, let's. I'm going to put that. I'm going to put Georgia up. Just make it a play here in the Donald Trump column, and I'm also going to put in Pennsylvania. That alone would bring it up to 254 votes. If Donald Trump, if he gets those 2 states, North Carolina and the state of Georgia, if he takes one more, let's say it's Arizona, which I also believe is going to go to Donald Trump takes the election. If it's Michigan, of course, it goes to Donald. Well, no, that'll be 269, so it'll still be close. So he would have to pick up Nevada as well, which I do believe he's going to win 275 to Kamala Harris's 226. So there's plenty of pathways to victory for Donald Trump, not as many for Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris has to win pretty much Pennsylvania. Here's the thing about Pennsylvania. We might not know the results of that state. 19 electoral votes, the highest number out of all the battleground states. We might not know the results of the election until potentially 4 days from now. Pennsylvania is historically and notoriously slow at counting their ballots. So let's put a Pennsylvania in Kamala Harris's column. That puts her at 245 based on what we know she already has. What she would need then is potentially the state of Wisconsin, which I think is part of the blue wall, which I think she is potentially going to win if she gets that, and Michigan. That brings Kamala Harris to 270 on the nose. So if Kamala Harris takes 3 of the battleground states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and the state of Michigan, Kamala Harris is your next president of the United States. So again, Pennsylvania is a big issue here. So again, watching that very closely. All right, so what has been a trend for the Donald Trump campaign is to finish all his campaigning in the great city of Grand Rapids, Michigan. He was there again last night. He stayed beyond midnight, so technically he was still there this morning. Didn't get back home from Michigan until 5 o'clock in Florida, where he later cast his ballot in front of the cameras, and he had a kind of an impromptu press conference in front of the cameras as well in Florida. But this was Donald Trump. We have a couple clips of him. This is the first one we have. Donald Trump speaking to a very supportive crowd in Grand Rapids.
The progress that this party has made is incredible. It's very inclusive. It's inclusive of everybody, including our great mayor right back there. That is our great mayor, and who came through for us. But I want to thank everybody, and a very special hello to Michigan. We're going to do some great things from Michigan. We're going to do great things from Michigan. We're going to bring the car business blazing back. You're not going to remember what it was like. We're going to make Detroit. We're going to make Detroit greater than it ever was. You know, I've been hearing about Detroit for a long time. They've been talking about that miracle in Detroit. Well, I mean, look, we got to be honest. It hasn't happened, but it's going to happen now. It's going to happen, and at levels that you never dreamt possible. So for the auto workers who have been so incredible, you've been so incredible. You're going to be You're going to be very happy with the things we're doing. We killed the plant, as you know, in Mexico. The biggest plant in the world was going to be built in Mexico, and I absolutely killed it. But I'd like to begin by asking a question. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Because over the past 4 years, Americans have suffered one catastrophic failure, betrayal, and humiliation after another. Kamala has delivered soaring prices and true economic anguish at home, war and chaos abroad, and a nation-destroying invasion on our southern border, invasion of some of the greatest criminals in the world that are pouring into our country. And we're not going to take that. We're going to end that, like, immediately. And I happen to think it's bigger than the economy. And I think, you know, every poll shows the economy and inflation and then the border and the horrible things that are going on. And I don't agree with it. I think we have to focus on all of it. We do it all one time. But to me, when you allow thousands of murderers into our country, to me, when you allowed the drug kingpins of the world into our, and terrorists into our country at levels that we've never seen before, to me, that's the bigger problem. We're going to solve it all, but that's the bigger problem. And we're going to have it taken care of very quickly. But my message to you and to all Americans tonight is very simple. We do not have to live this way. We don't have to live this way. We're not living good. 4 years, what did they do that was good? Can you name one thing? I said to a group of people, what have they done? Everything's a disaster, including nobody even knows how to. Supposing President Xi of China wanted to call to ask a little question about war or Taiwan or anything, who the hell does he call? We got a little problem in America. There's nobody to call. You know, they'll probably end up calling me. Maybe they'll call me. But, no. But who do you call? And remember, they ripped that presidency away from Joe Biden. Say what you want. We're not fans of Joe Biden. You know, I spent $150 million on him. We went through the convention. We never mentioned Kamala. Nobody knew who the hell she was. And all of a sudden, they picked Kamala, even though she was in last place. She came in number 13. They had 12 plus Kamala. She was considered the 13th. But then they wanted to be politically correct, so they picked Kamala. And they called her Harris, and nobody knew who Harris was. Like, call Harris. Who's Harris? Weird. You know, it's a very nice name, but it's a strange name because nobody knows who she is as Harris, so we have to call her Kamala. But she was the least popular. She got no votes. She lost in the primaries to Joe Biden and everybody else. She was the first one out. She quit the first one, 22 people. She left. She never made it to the great state of Iowa, never made it. And now we're running against her. But she's been exposed, you know, she's been exposed. She's a radical left lunatic who destroyed San Francisco. But we don't have to settle for weakness and incompetence and decline and decay. That's a nice word, decay. That's what's happened. That's a nice word, decay. Can you imagine? And nobody will question it because it's true. With your vote tomorrow, we can fix every single problem our country faces and lead America, indeed the world, to new heights of glory. Think of that statement, how beautiful that is. New heights of glory, that's what's going to happen. When we win the election and we're really, well, look, the ball's in our hand. All we have to do is get out the vote tomorrow. You get out the vote, they can't do anything about it, we win. One of their top people just got on television. I was coming in and they said, these are not looking good, these numbers for them. This is very troubling. At least he was honest. No, all we have to do, if we get out our people, it's over. There's nothing they can do about it. It's nice when you have that, right? You know? In other words, to make you feel a little guilty, we would only have you to blame. But we put ourselves in an unusual position. Never happened where we're leading by hundreds of thousands of votes in the early stage vote. That's never happened before. We've always been losing by sometimes millions of votes, and you keep catching them on Tuesday, but Tuesday comes along and you make it, or you don't quite make it, you're a little short, and then they cheat, and it makes it a little tougher. Because when you have open borders, transgender everything, high taxes, very high taxes, they're campaigning on the fact that they're going to raise everybody's taxes, and you have men playing in women's sports. You have to cheat. Who the hell is going to approve that stuff? Who's going to approve open borders with criminals pouring into our country by the millions? No, they have to cheat. They have to cheat, and they do it very well, actually. But I think we're in very good shape. We just have to show up, and you're going to have the biggest victory. You know what this will be? The single greatest victory, politically speaking, in the history of our country.
Yeah, that was Donald Trump last night in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and he could be right. This could be the most significant, at least if he said victory, but it could be the most significant turnout in the history of this country. When you consider the fact that early voting, there's already been more than, I think, 82 million votes that were cast prior to today. And then you look at the state of Michigan. There were, 9,600 people who registered by early this afternoon. Same day registration in the state of Michigan, and then went on to vote. And very, very concerning when you consider the fact there's no possible way that those people can be verified. They have to go through the Social Security Administration to make sure they actually are who they are. And we know also in the state of Michigan, there's about 36,000 people now who have registered on the voter rolls whose names do not match the Social Security Administration's data. Like they can't identify these people, yet they're still out there and potentially voting, at least by today. A number of states keep coming in. So Arkansas, they just closed their polls at 8:30, and we are already calling Arkansas for Donald Trump. Not a big surprise whatsoever. Not, of course, included as the battleground states, and not a big, huge win. They've got 6 electoral votes in the state of Arkansas. But again, as they come in, we'll be watching them and bringing that information to you. All right, I want to go to this half hour's guests, panelists. Caitlin Buss is the assistant editorial page director for the Detroit News, and James, that's right. We'll plan later to get to James Dixon. He's a journalist and he writes for the New York Post and also for Enjoyer.com. But I want to start with Caitlin Buss with the Detroit News. Caitlin, it's good to have you. I know it's a busy day for you, and it's going to be a busy night, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, it's good to spend time with you. It's been a fun day. It's been a fun week, but excuse me,
Yeah.
here we are.
Yeah, it's been a fun election season, I think, and everyone's saying this is it. The Kamala Harris side's and everything is riding on me winning, and Donald Trump is saying the same thing. Everything is riding on him winning, and it seems like both sides of the supporters agree this is a consequential election. I actually agree with it too. I think in my lifetime this is the most consequential when you consider the very different policy viewpoints that these two candidates have. Would you agree with that?
I agree, and I think we're seeing it like you were talking about just before before I came on in the turnout. I think 2020, scarred a lot of people on both sides of the aisle, then in Michigan, you had 2022 where we had some pretty record turnout, certainly among certain demographics. So we've been kind of, suffering, in my perspective, under the results of some of these elections, and so I think people have really realized their vote matters. With the new voting rules and the extended voting time, they really took advantage of it. I think, Trump's campaign was determined to make it, turn out so great that even if some cheating did go on or fraud or whatever they wanted to say, that it wouldn't matter. And we'll see if that happens. But I think Republicans have done better in this early turnout than Democrats expected.
Yeah, I think the message what I think Donald Trump put out there is, make it too big to rig, and that's kind of been his mantra for a long time. But when you look at the past 4 years, what's happened in the state of Michigan, a couple years ago during the midterms, the Democrats gained control of the House and the Senate. Of course, they already had the governor's office with Gretchen Whitmer in there. What they've done now with the election laws is they made it so easy not just to vote, but for fraud to occur. I mean, known things that will open the door to fraud, such as same day registration to vote. And we've already seen the consequences of that. There are tens of thousands of people now on Michigan's voter rolls who we don't know who they are. They don't even really maybe exist. Yet somehow they're going to be allowed to vote in this election. And these anonymous like it's impossible now if you are ineligible to vote and you cast your ballot. It's too late. Even if we catch you, it's too late. Can't go back and change the vote because we don't know where that ballot has gone. I mean, those kinds of things that are being allowed under this Democratic controlled House and Senate and governor's office with a very liberal Secretary of State who seems also to be pushing for these very lax election integrity policies. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I guess why do you think
Yeah.
that's going on?
I absolutely think it's going on. Benson came in kind of as part of this force, determined to improve access and accessibility to the ballot. And that was kind of her main goal. And I think she really lost sight of, making it secure and fair in the process. But I think that was somewhat intentional. I think that's part of her agenda. I think we'll see in the book coming out, she's been all about herself and about this idea of defending democracy. And she's put that really ahead of the interests of Michigan residents. I also think she has a gubernatorial run in view, so she's shoring up support, among important Democrats that would back her. But she's really made herself vulnerable in a lot of ways as well. I've documented some of it, giving money to sitting members of the Supreme Court, which
Yes.
has had the effect of, we don't know the effect, I guess, on the rulings that have come out of the Supreme Court that are in turn playing into the election. So it's very partisan here. I think, you mentioned the 500,000 people on our rolls that could have been taken off before the election, but will not be. I think when you see a place like Virginia and the leadership there of a governor like Glenn Youngkin, who really pushed to clean up the voter rolls, he really pushed, for Republicans in that state, and we're seeing it's very close right now. That's the kind of leadership, that would have helped Republicans. Obviously, we didn't expect that from Benson, but even a moderate approach from her would have been better than what we've gotten.
Yeah, moderate would have been nice. We would have accepted that at this point. And you spoke of, Virginia and the Department of Justice going after that state and Texas, and I think it was Alabama as well, because they dared to try to get these potential non-U.S. citizens off the voter rolls, and then DOJ comes in and sues those states to make sure they, if they took them off, you got to put them back on until after the election. It's just crazy stuff. James Dixon is now with us, journalist, writes for the New York Post, and also enjoyer.com. And I think you muted yourself, James. I don't know. Is that what you said, Cameron? Has James muted
We,
himself?
we're
No, you're good.
unmuted.
Okay, you're unmuted. Okay, you're good to go. I'm like, that would be strange because he likes to talk, so that's why I have you on here. I want to talk to you about this because this was and Kayla and I were just discussing this particular issue when it comes
Right.
to the early voting and then the registration, same day type of registration or registration, within that 14-day window that they used to have. It becomes impossible to verify these people who have registered to vote. And now we're finding out with the Social Security Administration, they can't even find who these people are. And that's in the state of Michigan. I think it's 36,000 people.
Right. And so to put that in perspective, Donald Trump won Michigan in 2016 by something like a little less than 11,000. He
Yeah.
lost in he
Hmm.
lost in 2020 by about 154,000. So these are huge numbers for a swing state, for any state. And so these are numbers that could affect an election. And the big takeaway is not just that it's happening, it's that it wasn't always this way. A decade ago, even just 5, 6 years ago, that number, that 35,000 you just quoted, was
Yep.
54 in 2018. So it's a
54.
man-made. You could say
54
it's a
people.
woman-made problem. It's 54 people, not 35,000. So it's a woman-made problem. These were choices that brought us to this point. We went from secure And every choice was made to make us less secure, to the day where you have more than a Chinaman's chance of being able to vote in Michigan illegally and that vote count.
Well, you bring that up for a reason because we did have a Chinese national vote in our election who is not a U.S.
We
citizen.
did.
They caught him,
Yeah.
Dana Nessel, and they came out and made a big deal about it, which
Well,
is
they
good.
didn't catch him. They didn't catch him. He reported himself.
Oh, he turned himself in. Okay, I
Yeah.
was not aware of
He,
that. All
he
right,
didn't.
so
The
but even
system didn't
so,
work.
his vote still counts.
Yes.
Why is that?
Because if they can go back and find his vote, then they can go back and find my vote or your vote. And I know you voted the wrong way, Tom. So you don't want them going back and finding how you voted. You don't want those records
No.
to become public.
Thankfully, it's anonymous. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So look, so that one got through. So if we can't fix it on the back end, we all accept that. We don't like it, but we accept it. Then
Yeah.
we must prevent it on the front end.
Right.
And that, and so, as a journalist, we listen for the dog that's not barking. And so when you see the greatest failure of Benson's career, a Chinese, that's the last country anyone wants to hear of voting. It's not Canadian, right? Chinese national votes in Michigan, the vote counts, and we wouldn't know about any of it if the guy hadn't turned himself in. What you would
Listen,
expect at that moment is for her to say, how can I close the barn door? What can we
you,
do to close these loopholes? And she hasn't said that.
so when you have a government, and I want to ask both of you this question because you're both journalists, you both write for various outlets and whatnot, and you said something that I think is very profound, and it's true that journalists' jobs are to pay attention to the dog that is not barking. In other words, you got to dig because especially in Michigan, that is a very non-transparent state. And both of you have written a lot about things that we wouldn't have known about unless you wrote about it. So, Caitlin, what are some of the biggest obstacles that you see working for a newspaper and trying to uncover things, trying to bring things that are very consequential issues are to the citizens in the state of Michigan and who read your newspaper that they wouldn't otherwise know about? Has it gotten more difficult in recent years than it used to be, do you think?
I think so. It's for me. It's important to note. I'm not an investigative reporter necessarily. I'm an opinion columnist. So my day job looks a little bit different than some of the others. But certainly, when material falls into my lap or I come across material that has not been reported, I think there's, a lot of pressure, a big standard to make sure it's true. That might be harder than it was in the past. Now we have to kind of rely on the reported material, it would seem, and to some extent, instead of trusting, the sourcing and kind of the raw investigative power that a newspaper has. Again, I'm speaking, just from my little perch over in the opinion corner and some of the investigative type stuff I've done, which I again wouldn't say is, that's not my day job. But the entire media sphere has gotten more challenging. I think you've seen competition from alternative media that's come in very successfully. There's a huge mistrust in the institution of it generally, and that's for good reason. There's only about 3 to 5% of the media is Republican right now, or self-identifying Republicans. Most of the people have college degrees, so when you're looking at analyzing a vote, which is primarily non-college educated individuals, there's a bias that comes in whether or not people know it. And I think with alternative media, people can go where they feel seen, heard, where they feel like they understand what's going on more. There's not just one outlet anymore. So of course it's a little bit more difficult.
I admit now I'm totally biased when it comes to this new program we're doing. And when I got into talk radio, I changed because I spent 20 some odd years as a news reporter, and it was a very we had a very stern warning that you cannot have any even hint of bias in your reporting, and you were held to task for that. And if you were befriending these local politicians, whether it's on a city council, a mayor, or someone in the state legislature or a governor, whatever it is, you were held to task in terms of, okay, you can't, we're going to be watching now. I mean, almost you have to recuse yourself if you're friends with somebody who's in office. That changed a number of years ago. And to me, what has happened, and one of the reasons I got out of journalism altogether was because I found out, at least in the legacy outlets and the newsrooms I was working in, and I knew this was the case now across the country, that the not only were the reporters becoming more and more biased, it's like the premise of their fact checking had changed to where the truth now was from a liberal standpoint, and then you built your stories on that premise. Not only that, but the politicians themselves were very intimidating. They were calling newsrooms, calling news directors, calling publishers, and calling editors. They were calling reporters, refusing to come on or give you access to them unless you acquiesced to their demands. And I saw that time and again. And James, maybe you can touch on this as well, but I know that there are, and I can name them, politicians who now are putting these news directors and executives under their thumb and will refuse them access unless they become more democratic friendly in their stories, whether it's television or radio or in
Right.
print. Are you seeing that, or am I just going crazy here?
I mean, I don't travel in those circles. It's like in dating, right? I'm sure there's women who are gold diggers, but in my position, I just haven't personally met any. So it's just different circles than I would normally travel in. So no, I have not been privy to many invites to the solstice party. I don't get the Christmas card from Big Gretch. And I don't want these things because I look at the people who get those end of year interviews. What news comes out of that? And the value of it is that the average person doesn't know that they're not getting news and doesn't know what that means. And so the average person looks at it like, oh, they got the governor to talk to them. They don't have the chops to say,
Yeah.
well, wait a minute, they didn't actually get anything from her. This is just some phraseology. This is just a waste of everyone's time in 2 pages of newsprint. And of course, the news isn't going to tell you that because they need you to buy the paper. They need you to, it's like Stringer Bell said on The Wire, whatever we call heroin's going to get sold.
Hmm.
Whatever we tell you is news is what's going to get sold.
Yes.
And so, yeah, you have pages filled with coverage and with pieces that explain what officials did rather than question what those people did. It's no wonder that people aren't embracing that because a good journalist is a very bad advocate. And we've seen that time and again in Michigan.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I've talked to journalism students in various universities, and I'll ask them a pretty basic question: why do you want to get into journalism? And a lot depends on their answer. And they'll say, well, because I want to change the world. And I said, so you want to be either an
Change the
activist or an
world.
advocate? Yeah. What do you want to change the world? And I've heard some students say because a particular candidate, I'll say it, because Donald Trump wants to kill black people. That was one of the answers I got in
Okay.
a journalism class, and I thought, okay, if you're going to write a story on that, let's build it from the very premise. Where are you getting your information? Where's your data source? And they couldn't, of course, that's not true what they were
Unless you got
saying.
a Superman suit in the phone booth, I'm unclear about how a journalist is going to stop anyone from killing black. Like, what is this stuff? I was
Well,
blessed
and
when I was a rookie. Oh, go on, Caitlin.
well, some of this is the result of progressive education in general, right? I mean,
Yes.
if you have to have a journalism degree and you're going to school for 4 years studying nothing but journalism, you're not only are you not gaining really real world experience, but you're not learning about any other disciplines. I was
No,
very
no.
happy to graduate from a place that wouldn't offer a journalism major for that very purpose. They had a
Yeah.
program. And so that's kind of what I was mentioning, having college degrees, all these kinds of
Mm.
biases that come in. The old newspaper man or woman, didn't necessarily need all that. They just wanted to be scrappy and get the first crack at the news.
Oh yeah, I miss those days. But you're right. Yeah, the majors, the journalism majors. I know Hillsdale College. They don't offer. They offer a minor in
Right.
journalism, and then your major is in something else, whether it's history or political science or whatever it might be. And that's
Humanities.
humanities,
Humanities, because
right?
you don't need to. I think about during COVID, right? I didn't need to know the science because I knew human nature and I knew
Mm,
humans couldn't be trusted with the amount of power that
yeah.
Gretchen Whitmer was demanding for herself. When you know human nature, the specifics become less important. And so the problem with journalism school, especially a 4 year program, so basically the rule of journalism is like quote people accurately and spell their names right. I'm unclear on how you spend the other 4 years.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. But you both touch on a very important point. I don't know if it's going to fix if it's going to get fixed. I do
It's not
know
going to get
this.
fixed.
There's a lot of stuff to sift through, and it's very difficult to do. One of those things we mentioned, Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson. She was interviewed, I think, today, and people were asking her, when do you think you'll have the results of this election? So the polls close mostly 8 o'clock in almost every county in the state of Michigan. There are 4 who are in the central time zone. They'll close in about 9 minutes from right now. But Jocelyn Benson seems to think that she might be able to have the results of this election tonight, maybe at the latest tomorrow morning. Do you think that's the case based on what we saw back in 2020?
I think
Caitlin,
it
I'll start
needs
with
to
you.
be.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it used to
No,
be.
no.
Good. Yeah, I think there's no reason that that can't happen, especially with the 2
Right.
years of voting we had leading up to this. So, I mean, there's really no reason we shouldn't be able to know. I think it's very interesting, all the groundwork that has been laid for us not knowing. And, I think that speaks something too. I mean, anytime, and I don't know how James will respond to this, but anytime you have the story coming out before the story's happened, I think you need to be suspect. And if they're trying to say, hey, the story is we're not going to know, that makes me suspicious of why aren't we going to know, and why are you all in lockstep in saying this is what's going to happen?
That's a very good point.
So
All
we have
right.
a woman,
So,
Jocelyn Benson, who's going to be running for governor in 2 years, wants a promotion from what she has now, which is a statewide, central to your life, important office. Why would such a person then tell you that it would take them a day to count votes, 24 hours to count votes? She has every incentive to present as competent and good at her job, but now she's telling you it takes me a day.
hmm.
Was it so she could come out today and say, "Oh, it'll only take me a half day"? And why are we playing these little games? Why can't we have someone in Michigan, someone in Lansing who we elect to represent us, who's just good at their job, wire to wire? Like, is that too much to ask?
Well, one of the things when she first ran, and I spoke to her, what was it, 2018 or 2020? I forget when it was. I think 2018.
2018, yeah.
Yeah, 2018. And I sat across the table in an editorial meeting, and we asked these questions of all the candidates. She came in one day and she said, we're going to make it very incredibly efficient on election night. We're going to have results like that because of all the technology I'm going to implement. And the opposite turned out to be the case. So it's kind of like, what are you doing? You're not very good at your job if that's the results. Yeah, there's a lot of technology now, but the technology doesn't seem to be helping. I want to get your thoughts on this because there's some very large polls that have come out. And we're talking about a sampling of 150,000 Americans, where 70% of them believe that the nation is like very seriously on the wrong track. They want, and I think it's about 55% of those think they want there to be a massive sweeping change in this country because they feel like we're going to go off a cliff. And I look at those numbers and I think to myself, how is this race so close? If they say what we need, if 70% of the people in this country think, and that's like 10% more than it was in 2020, I think it was 60% back then during COVID, during Donald Trump, 70% now feel this way. And yet we're seeing this race in Michigan and all these other battleground states incredibly close, too close to call. Does that make sense to either one of you? James, I'll start with you.
I've been doing this thought experiment on my timeline and with my friends. I asked them 2 questions. One, if your preferred candidate were to win today, if Donald Trump wins, why'd they win? And if Donald Trump loses, why'd they lose? Like you have to be able to see it from both ends. And you have to be able to and so the problem I'm encountering, like when I talk to a lot of Democrats today, they're positive that Democrats have it in the bag. When I talk to Republicans, they're positive that Republicans have it in the bag. And I think we live such separate realities that there's no kind of public square that we all trust anymore. It might have been a place like CNN a decade ago. That's not in existence anymore. And so you have right wingers listening to people telling them what they want to hear. We have left wingers telling them what they want to hear. And so what it leaves open is the truth. What it leaves open is the truth, but I wonder how big that market really is because we do have a lot of people who just want to hear their preferred narrative. And so
Mm-hmm.
anything that requires so yeah, it's funny. Everyone says they want fundamental change, but no one can be bothered to read past the headline of a news story.
No, they don't. And it has
So
changed
someone's not
considerably.
telling the truth here.
Right. Well, I also
Right.
think it has to
You
do with
want
what
things to change, but you don't want to do anything about it. So I see a real problem.
I also think it also depends on your perspective of what change looks like or from what you want to change. If you're Kamala Harris, she's saying we need to change. She's in office right now. Trump says the same thing. Kaylee, what do you
Right.
think when you look at this? 70% of people want the country to go in a different direction, yet these races are so close.
Yeah, I think, similar to that, there's most people think it's in the wrong direction or have a negative outlook on the future of the country. So, what I think will be interesting to see over the next few hours is how significant those first time
Mhm.
voters, that low propensity voter was. Because I think, sure, people were in their camps, people who've voted before, people who are informed, kind of known quantities, were in their camps a long time ago. And I don't think there was a ton of movement among them, you know, and we've seen that in the polling. I mean, it's neck and neck. But I think what people maybe didn't capture is the uninformed voter. I hate to say that, or the person who's just that mad, and that's what's showing up in this "We Want Change" polling, and came out and voted for the first time, and no one really knew what they were going to do. Also, the youth vote, which I think has historically, we've seen at least recently gone very Democratic. We just don't know how that stuff's going to go. So I think that anger is reflected in some of the polling. We see it. But when it comes down to polling the campaigns, it's really hard to pick up on the pulse of the most basic voter in America. I mean, where is that person landing?
Hmm.
And now in the early return results, it's looking decent for Republicans. So we'll just have to see.
Yep, interesting night. Absolutely. I know both of you are very, very busy, so I'm appreciative to both of you for joining me on this inaugural edition of Election Night coverage on Tom Jordan Live. Caitlin Buss with the Detroit News and James Dixon with New York Post and Enjoyer.com. You guys, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Tom.
All right,
Yeah,
have a good
thanks.
night. Yeah, it's amazing. And when you hear all the different messaging that is out there, one of those messages we hear a lot is about women. Who is a big threat to women? Who's the biggest threat? And the Democrats will say it's Donald Trump. And yet we see these things playing out in real time that are actually legitimate threats to a variety of ways that women live. It can be in sports, it can be in their locker rooms and things of that nature. Megyn Kelly, we're going to play this clip from her. She was at a Donald Trump rally yesterday in Pennsylvania before Donald Trump came to Grand Rapids in Michigan. And she spoke to this issue. I think she did a fabulous job at explaining to not just to women, but to men, the importance of the woman vote and who is better for them. Here's Megyn Kelly yesterday in Pennsylvania.
Megyn Kelly is here, and she's doing. Come up, brother. Come up here, Megyn.
She ripped a guy apart.
Thank you. Nice to see you. Hi, everybody. Hey, it's great to see you. Can you believe this guy? Can you believe the energy and the stamina on this guy? At his age, I'm ready to go to sleep over there. He's got another rally to go to till tonight. Let me tell you, first of all, one of the reasons why I wanted to come here, one of the many reasons I wanted to come here. When I launched my show 4 years ago, we had Mark Cuban on the program. Yeah. May have seen he was in the news this week. And he started going on about how bad America's race history was and how ashamed he was of America, and that's why he was at all these protests, and he felt it was really important to stand up and speak out about human rights violations. And then it got awkward when I asked him about all the money he was taking from China. Then he dropped a bunch of F-bombs, and I thought, I really enjoy this feeling of proving Mark Cuban wrong. And so here I am at a Trump rally, a strong, intelligent woman to prove Mark Cuban wrong again. I won't take up much of your time, but I do want to tell you the main reasons I am voting for Donald Trump. Number one, immigration. He mentioned it. And people like Laken Rowley. I'll be thinking about her tomorrow all day. 22 years old, killed in Georgia, a young nursing student by an illegal. I'll be thinking about Jocelyn Nungare, 12 years old, in Texas, murdered by 2 Venezuelan illegals. President Trump closed the border. Kamala Harris opened it by choice. It wasn't accidental. She said it would be humane. That's what she and her boss believed. Tell it to Lake and Riley's family. There was nothing humane about it. He closed it. They opened it. It was an intentional choice, and there's no reason not to believe they won't do it again. The boys should not be in the girls' sports. The boys should not be in the girls' bathrooms. The boys should not be in the girls' locker rooms. Peyton McNabb, North Carolina sophomore in high school, slammed so hard in the face by a volleyball hit at her by a boy pretending to be a girl, she suffered traumatic brain injury and permanent paralysis. Kamala Harris looks at her and says, "Be kind, suck it up." And that's what's right. Why do our girls have to face brain damage in order to be kind to boys who want to invade their sports? And by the way, they are going into the women's prisons. She changed the law in California to make sure the taxpayers would pay for their sex change operations. She was not just following the law, she changed the law. President Trump will stop it. He got mocked by the left for saying he would be a protector of women. He will be a protector of women, and it's why I'm voting for him. He will close the border. He will keep the boys out of girls' sports and where they don't belong. And you know what else? One more thing. He will look out for our boys, too. Our forgotten boys and our forgotten men. Guys like you. Guys like these guys, who've got the calluses on their hands, who work for a living with the beards and the tats, who maybe have a beer after work and don't want to be judged by people like Oprah and Beyonce, who will never have to face the consequences of her disastrous economic policies. These guys will. He gets it. President Trump gets it. He will not look at our boys like they're second-class citizens. And ladies out there who want a bit of girl power in this election, let me tell you something. How can you win when the sons and the husbands and the brothers and the dads you love are losing? It's not a win. We care, young women and older, about the lives of our children, the safety of our children. And we need not get so obsessed with what happens when they're in the womb that we forget about taking care of them once we're here and they're loved. Last point, what I don't want, what I don't think you want, is the left's version of masculinity. You see that ad they did about Trump voters trying to encourage women to lie to their husbands so that they could vote for her instead of Trump? That's their version of what marriage looks like. An overbearing husband who bullies his wife into saying she voted one way as opposed to an honest, open relationship. Oh, wait, I'm talking about Kamala and Doug. Okay, sorry. Where was that story in the news? Where was that story? I don't remember a single media person, not one, who sat with him, asked him about the abuse allegations against him by a successful professional attorney who has great details, who has receipts, who has witnesses. No one even asked about it. I'm not into their version of toxic masculinity or new masculinity. I prefer the old version. Them, all of you, and I prefer a president who understands how to be strong and how to fight. I hope all of you do what I did last week. Vote Trump and get 10 friends to vote Trump too.
All right, that was Megyn Kelly. I thought she did a good job last night explaining, how a lot of people feel. I don't think everyone is buying into you have to be a certain way if you're a woman or a man or this gender ideology and identity politics. And she spoke out for women the way she sees it, and I think she did a great job. And clearly, a lot of people Agree with her. All right, so we are back now just after 9 o'clock. We have more polls that are closing, and we're looking at a number of races. And I'm just going to go quickly around some of the new ones that have come out and the states that have been called. Colorado has been called for Kamala Harris, and it was a close. No, I'm sorry, that's not true. 77% Kamala Harris. I was surprised for a moment when I saw a number pop up. That was not the case. 77 for Kamala Harris, 20% for Donald Trump in the state of Colorado. Wyoming right now already being called for Donald Trump. Expected same with South Dakota and in North Dakota as these central time zone markets states are beginning to close. Kansas for Donald Trump. Missouri for Donald Trump as well. Don't have the results in yet for Iowa and Minnesota. That might take some time. But I do want to go to one particular race real quickly before I get to my guest here. And we'll talk about this with her as well. But the very consequential Senate race in the state of Michigan is this one between Mike Rogers, the Republican, and Alyssa Slotkin, the Democrat. And right now, these early numbers that are coming in shows Alyssa Slotkin with a strong lead over Mike Rogers at 53% to Mike Rogers' 44%. This is still incredibly early right now. And, it's a tough one because Mike Rogers is a very well-respected Republican candidate and who had served on the House Intelligence Committee. He was the chair of the House Intelligence Committee when he served in Congress, but very well known. And he served that same district in Congress that Alyssa Slotkin currently serves in right now. She's giving up that seat to run for Senate. Alyssa Slotkin has portrayed herself as a moderate, but she's voted very, very far left, very progressive on a whole array of issues. And when it comes to the economy, when it comes to illegal immigration, when it comes to these gender issues and women and boys and girls' locker rooms, those types of things. But when she comes out, she has this CIA data analyst background, and she presents herself in such a way that you would look at her and think that she is absolutely a moderate. That is not the case when you look at her voting record. All right, there are a lot of things to watch for as more polls are closing in 3 states. That includes Nevada. That'll be at 10 o'clock Eastern time. So we're looking for that in the next hour or so. And that's going to be another consequential race as we hone in on these battlegrounds, primarily Georgia, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Michigan, Nevada, Arizona, and the like. And one state I've been in, North Carolina, I mentioned as well. But there's an interesting race in a state, which is Minnesota, which my guest is hailing from. Roshini Rajkumar is in the Minneapolis area of Minnesota and joins me back in the program here. Roshini, it's nice to see you. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Great to be with you. Election day is such a fun day in America, Tom.
It really is. And I just love the process. I was up early today. I'm sure you were as well. And I know you do a lot there in Minnesota. You're the host of the Crisis Files podcast. You're an attorney, you're a journalist, and you're an analyst as well. But, you look at what's happening. Since I brought it up, let me bring this up again real quickly. But this Senate race in Michigan between Mike Rogers and Alyssa Slotkin, to me, and again, it's still early, but I didn't think it'd be this close this early on either. There's almost a 10-point gap with Alyssa Slotkin leading Mike Rogers in the state. What are your thoughts on that particular race?
Right. Well, I think it's a lot about the ground game as well as the name recognition. And in this case, both of those candidates have that name recognition, but it's kind of like, what have you done for me lately? Right. And Slotkin has probably done some things for Michiganders lately. So I think that's part of that. It's also, your state is so interesting in that both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump were really trying to court you for the last several months. And, it could go either way. These electoral votes of yours are so coveted, but it doesn't mean that this state and everyone in the state is distinctly red or distinctly blue. So I think that that's why we can't call it yet, although Slotkin seems to be that early favorite. This is also why I'm not a big fan of reporting too early before at least 20 to 30 or even more percent of the votes come in for an entire state. But that's just me. I tend to be a little bit more conservative when it comes to calling the races and making any predictions about winners, Tom.
And that's the right way to go. I used to hate that when I used to live out in California and was a reporter out there, and the polls closed there, obviously 8 o'clock, but that's West Coast. And in many election years, the races were already called by the time before the polls even closed in California. And it was amazingly frustrating for voters out there to see that happen. And sometimes they were wrong. We think back to 2000, and there was Tom Brokaw there saying we're calling the race for Al Gore at that point, and we thought, you got to be kidding me. We're not even done here yet. It turns out he was wrong in that case, a whole egg on your face type of situation. Give us a sense of what's happening in your state right now, in Minnesota. I have family out there. I know Minnesota is really, historically, at least as of late, a blue state. It leans liberal, of the past several presidential election cycles. With Tim Walz now being the vice presidential candidate, and I'm looking at it, it seems like it's almost too close to call when you look at Minnesota right now. I know it still leans Democratic in the presidential race, but what is happening in real time in that state in which you sit?
Well, this state definitely leans blue. If you remember back to 1984, when Vice President Mondale ran with Geraldine Ferraro
Hmm.
and only carried his home state of Minnesota and the District of Columbia, if I remember correctly. I wasn't of legal voting age at that time, so I wasn't voting in that election. But I remember watching. I was very, very enthralled with politics at that time. I remember Mario Cuomo spoke at the Democratic convention in 1984. And I would say that pinpointed or gave birth to my big love of politics and inspirational politicians. We don't have as many of them anymore. But what I would tell you about on the ground here, I'll just first start with anecdotally. I voted this morning around 9 a.m. Central Time, and I am in a new voting area. And Tom, you know some of the suburban names in Minneapolis. I live in the suburb of
Hmm.
Edina, which
Yes.
borders Minneapolis.
Hmm.
Borders Minneapolis. I used to live in Minneapolis during the racial awakening of 2020. I could see some of the ashes flying in the air from the balcony of our place from uptown Minneapolis. So it was a really scary time back then, 4 years ago. Today at 9 a.m., and mind you, polls opened at 7 a.m., I was voter 277 in my small little area neighborhood voting precinct. I waited in line, not out the door yet, but a pretty good line. Waited. Everyone was really happy, copacetic, got my sticker, which is always fun every year. But I was amazed and also really heartened that at 9 a.m., I was voter 277 in just this one small polling precinct. And that gives you just a little bit of a picture of the real expression of exercising that vote. And that's really happening all over Minnesota today, or it did happen as our polls have closed now. But it really was. And there were lines all over the place. I was watching some of the coverage, hearing about some of the coverage, and actually seeing lines as I was driving past other polling places. So that's just some anecdotal evidence. I'm no longer a reporter, so I'm not out there, gathering all those details and evidence. But what I will say in watching the coverage now for the last couple hours across the various networks and online and your show, it is interesting to see not only the lines, but when you look at the number of actual votes, so not the percentages, but when you look at the number of actual votes, it goes back and really harkens to our founders: one person, one vote. And over time, that had to be enlarged to women, to people of color. So the founders didn't exactly get that part right from the very beginning. But the essence of one person, one vote lives very boldly, even today, in November 2024, Tom. And that's what makes me really happy as an American citizen, that this could come down to thousands of votes, tens of thousands of votes, whatever that number ends up being on the popular vote side. One person, one vote really does matter.
It absolutely does. And I very much love the state, how the states really control. I mean, I love the Electoral College, and the reason why I love it is because it's supposed to be, in my view, about how each state matters in these elections. We are the United States of America. And within the states, the popular vote is what carries that state over to, whichever candidate is going to win those electoral votes in that particular state. And it is very encouraging I love the close races. When I was younger, a younger voter, there was always a blowout one way or the other, whether it was, George H.W. Bush back then with Michael Dukakis, or, and then you got the other W. Bush with, Al Gore was a very close race, and obviously that mattered in the state of Florida. But by and large, most of my voting life, there have been blowouts where I felt my vote didn't really count. And nowadays, in recent years, it's like, yeah, you got to get out there and vote. And I think maybe that's one of the reasons why more people are engaging in the process. They're understanding how consequential and how important it is to do this. I want to go back to your state in Minnesota because, we're very familiar with Amy Klobuchar, the senator in the state of Minnesota. And there's this race she's got against Royce White, the Republican, in this. There's other candidates as well, the Libertarian and whatnot with Rebecca Whiting. I know it's very early there, yeah, and right now Amy Klobuchar is down 42 to Royce White's 54%. But again, very few votes have yet been counted. How do you foresee that race shaping up?
I love that you shared those percentages because, yes, I saw that race on my ballot this morning. I voted. Here's the thing. Amy Klobuchar has gotten a lot of national attention. In the past, she actually tried running to be the Democratic nominee for president in the past. She has major name recognition. She is, I believe it's her third term she's running for. I mean, it's a name that I think for many years, definitely the last election, nobody thought she was touchable, and she blew out her opponent. So the very fact that even in the early percentages, Tom, you're quoting that number and Royce White is ahead. I mean, I don't know that anyone would have predicted that just a few months ago for Amy Klobuchar. So that's definitely a hot race that we're watching here. I think it's also part of what's happening in my home state of Minnesota. Ever since the events of May 2020, our state hasn't gone back to neutral, hasn't gone back to total safety. So that is going to be one of the things that when we do the exit polls as well as the analysis post-election, how much did some of the events of 2020 and the fact that in 2024, we are not fully safe in downtown Minneapolis, in downtown St. Paul. And as much as the mayors of those cities are trying to bring it back, corporate America hasn't fully come back to those downtowns, and that says a lot. It's a big reason why a lot of the suburbs have seen outsized growth, not only in population, but in social, on the weekends. Where are people hanging out? And I mean, sadly, that kind of mirrors what has happened with Detroit and its suburbs in the past. I know Detroit has had a resurgence, which I always love to read about and see, but that is really going on right here in the state of Minnesota. And that's why this year, even if Minnesota goes blue, I don't think it will be a high percentage compared with past presidential years.
I wonder, and I thought about this back then, what happened in May of 2020, as you described, has affected as it's been 4 years now since the George Floyd killing and then the riots that ensued after that. And, when you think about, you have time to digest. Yeah, there was a lot of anger about the killing of George Floyd, and that was immediate during a presidential election year. And I think back then maybe there was a lot of animosity towards police in that area. But then you think about the number of businesses that were burned down and the court. I mean, I still remember many of those images, the violence that was occurring. And I spoke to a number of people from Minnesota on my program at the time who said, listen, I live in a majority community, and our businesses were burned down to the ground. And they were lamenting the fact that this was a reaction, not that they were supportive of the killing of George Floyd. That was horrible. But at the same time, why were they paying the price on this? And I wonder, in your view, if you think after reflecting on this for 4 years, that may have maybe brought, I don't know the impact that's had on this particular election. Do you think it has had an impact, that people are starting to wonder, why were we so supportive of defunding the police? Why was that a reaction immediately after the killing of George Floyd? Do you think that has any bearing on this election?
It absolutely has bearing on this election. The city of Minneapolis has lost a huge number of its police force. For the size population that Minneapolis is, it should have a near 1,000 member police force. And in about 2020, I think the numbers were just shy of 800. I don't
Mm,
even know if we're at 600 right now.
wow.
So that just tells you that many officers took early retirement. Some just decided if they were in police academy, they weren't going to go to Minneapolis. And others, maybe future officers who wanted to be officers, said, I'm going to try a different profession or left the state entirely. And I know personally some people who were officers in the burbs here as well as Minneapolis who took early retirements because of the backlash against the Blue Shield. Well, one thing that I've seen in Minneapolis is that more and more people are for the police. Everyone understands we need safety. We need good policing, not aggressive, but good, solid, and civil policing. And more. And there are many officers who were that way before 2020 and have been that way since. So what I've seen is a better attitude toward police overall, but we've also lost a lot of safety in the city of Minneapolis. It was partially a reason why my husband and I decided to leave and move back to my hometown, which I said I
Mm,
would never do. I said I
mm.
would never live in a suburb ever again in my life because I always lived in cities when I was in my television reporting career. I love being a city girl, but I also feel pretty darn safe in Edina, Minnesota.
Yeah, I bet you do. And I used to when I used to visit Minneapolis more often. I loved the downtown. I always felt safe pretty much in downtown Minneapolis. It didn't have that feel that, at the time that Detroit had or these other major cities. But things changed quite a bit back in 2020, and directly involved in that was your governor, Tim Walz, who was the current vice presidential candidate. And there was a lot of pushback on the way that he handled the riots in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, not to mention Kamala Harris, who is now, Tim Walz is now Kamala Harris's running mate, but her involvement in Minnesota as well. And, pushing to bail out some of these criminals that were involved in these violent protests. And I just wonder, what the feeling is from Minnesotans there towards Kamala Harris and Tim Walz based on what happened in 2020.
Well, I think it really does depend on who you talk with. There are definitely a lot of pro Kamala Harris and pro Tim Walz people in the state of Minnesota, just as there is a growing number of pro Trump and JD Vance, his running mate. So that's why I think for me as an analyst, this is going to be a very interesting and unique with a lot of different nuances. The way the results shape up and what kind of analysis we do after the fact. What I can tell you, which is interesting to watch about Kamala Harris, recently you probably saw a video of her being interviewed, and she did not answer about how she voted on a proposition in her state of
Hmm.
California
Hmm.
about increased penalties for criminals. I thought that would have been a really great opportunity if I were coaching her to try to get some votes that she might not have. I would have said, if you voted for steeper penalties, make that public. She did not want to share which way she voted. And that was a lost opportunity, which I will say, as a strategic message person and someone who coaches executives on that, that was a lost opportunity. What I will tell you about Tim Walz in 2020, I was a radio host for a station, a big station in the Minneapolis market. And prior to the events of May 2020, he doesn't come on a lot of radio shows every time you ask. And I didn't ask him often. But while he was running for governor, as well as after he became governor, he would come on my radio show. After the events of May 2020, I was one of the people on the airwaves who was very critical of him for standing in the way of allowing the Minneapolis mayor to call in the National Guard on that night of, I believe it was May 25, 2020. And he never came on after that. I asked several times for him to come on from his office and either got no answer or a no. So these are the kinds of things that I can just say from my own experience about Governor Walz. And this is part of his record that I don't think got a ton of coverage during these last few months that he and Kamala Harris were campaigning.
I'm glad you said that because I've had the same experience in 2020 as well. Because I would ask some pretty tough questions, critical questions of what was happening in our state of Michigan in relation to the riots back then and COVID. And I would ask our governor, because she had the state locked down, but then she would go out and participate in some of these protests, arm in arm with people, while we were sitting at home, not allowed to go outside of our houses. And I would ask her questions, and she also refused to stop coming on the program. And as it relates to journalism, I asked a couple other journalists this earlier in this broadcast. Have you noticed that change? Because it didn't used to be that way in my experience when I was a younger reporter in television out in California. And you would ask the candidates, and the politicians were expecting there to be difficult questions, and they would answer them, and they knew they had to come on and answer the questions. Nowadays, they just say, I'm not coming on any longer. You no longer have access to me. Have you noticed that's the case?
I've noticed that has grown. I think there are some other phenomena, though, that have accompanied whether they come on or not. There are so many more outlets that are asking for these interviews. And some of the outlets are not necessarily those traditional journalistic outlets that have reporters that vet information, whether it's some kind of online, podcast, and it's done by someone who just decides they want to have opinions, and they're not necessarily, whether it's trained or working journalists. So I would say my life as a talk show host is very much informed by my past life as a television news reporter, as a journalist. So even as a talk show host, someone who, now shares opinions openly, I still want to stick to the facts. I still am not going to stretch the truth, even while being provocative and often irreverent. I definitely still want the facts.
Yes. Well, you've never been irreverent with me, which I'm so utterly grateful for, because other people are. So I appreciate it very much. One final thought. I want to get your take on this, because there was a poll I saw out today, and it was like of 150,000 American voters who are saying, not only are they, it's like 70% of those voters say they're incredibly frustrated with the direction of this country. They staunchly disagree with the direction. And a big number of them, I think it's 60 something percent, say they want sweeping change, substantial reform on the way we're being governed currently in this country. Being that's the case, it stumps my mind. I don't fully understand why this race is so close if that's how they feel. Is it the way that they look at change? Who they would like to, maybe they think Donald Trump is the one who's currently responsible for this, not Kamala Harris, or what do you think is going on here in the psyche of the American voter?
Well, at least the people that are voting against Donald Trump, their psyche, in my mind, even if they're the ones saying, I'm not happy with my pocketbook right now, I'm not happy with the course of our economy, it is a sheer hatred for Donald Trump. That's what it comes down to, because frankly, if you just look at messaging, Kamala Harris hasn't really told us exactly what she's going to do differently from the current administration of which she is a part, or separate herself enough from President Biden, the president she serves with. So we haven't seen that. So it's really interesting that this race in some parts of the country is so close. And a lot of it is the anti or the hatred of Donald Trump. It's not, Kamala Harris's policies are better than Donald Trump's. Donald Trump actually has a record of his own that we could look to. It is just that sheer hatred. So that's what is an interesting piece and layer to this election that I don't know that we've really ever seen before in a final presidential election.
Yeah, I agree. And both sides say they don't want an authoritarian in power as well. And they're pointing the finger at each other. It's a crazy time. Very much appreciate it. Roshini Rajkumar, host of the Crisis Files podcast. We'll talk again soon, Roshini. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tom.
Appreciate it. All right. So, yeah, that poll that I'd mentioned, it's about 150,000 people. And it also shows that a quarter of voters in this country, they want complete upheaval in how the country is governed. And here's why they say that. Because of the economy, the current economy right now, the cost of living and the high rate of inflation over the past 3.5 years. And they're also very concerned about future stability. And that's economic stability, but it's also when it comes to the idea of our foreign affairs and national security and the lack of security within the country, the crime rate, but also the massive, potentially. Donald Trump says 30 million illegal immigrants have come across the border in 3.5 years. I think maybe it's more about 15. In any case, it's a huge number of people, and that, of course, necessarily has its effect on the future of stability in this country. All right. Ohio has now been called for Donald Trump. And also, I think it's, Wyoming. I mentioned that, North and South Dakota as well. So more polls are going to close here in about 30 minutes. Right now, I want to bring in Rob Johnson. He's the CEO of Wayne Radio, and he is why we are here today. Rob, good to see you.
What's happening, Tom?
Hey, I know this is like the Super Bowl to you, when it comes to election night, 2024. It's a big, big deal, and you typically stay up all night watching the elections. What's your interest? I mean, why is this such an appeal to you?
I think it's exciting to see people just get out there and vote and talk about issues that matter and actually put their money where their mouth is and go and cast their ballot for the person, candidate, issue, whatever it might be, for what they believe and what the country should look like in the future. So for me, since I was, probably 18 to 22, I've always been interested in this. And this is something that, to me, just resonates on a really deep level. So, very interested in what's happening tonight.
Right. So someone says, elections don't really matter. It doesn't really matter who wins the Oval Office. It won't have any impact on your life. We have all these, barriers in place to prevent. Do you buy into that, or do you think that it is very consequential? It does matter who ends up winning, particularly, the White House, but also these other Senate and House races.
I think that's a nice thing to say for people when they're like, oh, this really doesn't matter. But then 3 months later, they're like, I can't believe what the government's doing. So it's very inconsistent where people's logic lie on this issue. And it's just as important at the local and state level as is at the federal. Federal obviously gets the most attention because that's where the media lies. But to me, local, state, federal, it's all incredibly important. And even, for something like small business owners, what Trump did with the tax cuts for small business owners in 2016, still having massive impacts for small business owners today. And that's really important.
We'll get into that because we're also hearing this mixed messaging that's out there that he only gave tax cuts to the billionaires while the rest of us were suffering. I'm like the definition of middle class. That's how I look at myself. And I know those tax cuts benefited me and my wife, my kids greatly. And I was incredibly grateful for that. So when I hear that, I think, this is not adding up. But as a small business owner, you're a very successful business owner here in the state of Michigan. I guess expand on that a little bit. How do those tax cuts affect people like you or maybe restaurant owners or anybody who's in business?
Yeah, a big part of the Trump tax cuts was the first 20% of your net profit you don't have to pay taxes on. It's anything after that, and that's major. That's the difference. You think about 20% of $1 million. We're talking about $200,000. That's 3 to 4 full-time positions that can be created as a result of this tax cut. And when people talk about tax cuts for, the ultra rich, of course, that does happen in some circumstances. But you look at people that were living in California, some of these higher state income tax states, they were paying more in taxes after the Trump tax cuts at the upper end of the bracket. So it's not necessarily true that it's across the board that everybody is, getting a tax cut if they're ultra wealthy. Some cases, yes. Some cases, no. It's not as clear cut as what people would like to say.
But then you hear, profits it's almost as if profits are kind of this evil that exists. And you hear that from certain candidates and certain politicians that, these companies are making profits while you and I are suffering at home. And I think you touched on something very important because if you don't make profits, you can't hire people to do jobs and people suffer more and more from that. And you just mentioned that with a 20%, tax?
Yeah. You're not taxed on 20%, the first 20% of
your profit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that means you can go out and hire 3 or 4 more people.
Yeah. And the math, it's probably a little bit less than that when you look at the math because you're, what the tax rate is on that business, compared to what you're saving on the overall, net income. But, for me, when people talk about, these evil business owners, there's absolutely evil business owners out there that take advantage of people and don't put their people first. And I've always been on the side of advocating for business owners to be responsible, to treat people exceptionally well. and that the government needs to treat business owners exceptionally well. Small businesses make up 50% of the American economy. And the government needs to start acting like that's the case, or else small businesses are going to start disappearing, which is then going to inject more corporation, more foreign entities, things that people don't want. So it's contradictory when people have different legislation on this at the federal level, because it's forcing small businesses out of the marketplace and not allowing them to compete.
I think there's a different ideology as well when it comes to who should be providing the jobs out there, and there's certainly an ideology that says, well, the government should be funding, taxpayer-funded jobs should be going out, and there's also the idea of the free market, and that's I think where you lie. That's where I lie in terms of I think that's best for individuals in this country and overall economy. It's best to let the market do what it will. Supply and demand. What do people want? And let's make enough supply for that kind of thing, and that seems to have worked for a couple hundred years in this country.
Yeah, it's not a perfect system, but it's a good system. It's not, you can point to cases where free markets create monopolies that put people at unfair advantages. You look at, Walmart moving into small towns and taking over small businesses, and that's something that happens, right? So that's why I say it's not a perfect system, but it's the best system that we have. And I haven't seen a competing ideology that can do better than, an open market.
All right. So you are, would you call yourself or classify yourself as a political nerd in a sense?
Sure.
In the best sense of the word?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, good. All right. So you're watching the results come in tonight. What have you noticed?
So a couple things that I've noticed so far, I was just in the green room before I came in, and we were looking at the AP and their updates. So it looks to me like North Carolina and Georgia are going to, go Republican. Mm-hmm. It seems that Wisconsin out of the gates, and it's mainly Republican counties that have been counted thus far, but it looks like that's, in my opinion, Wisconsin is going to flip red. And if that's the case, and Trump hangs on to Nevada and Arizona, then I believe he's at 272. So that's the interesting trend that I've seen. New Hampshire is one of those states, you and I talked about this earlier today, that I thought might be a surprise state. Minnesota could be a surprise state, although somewhat unlikely, because that's Walz's home state. But that's what I've seen thus far. I do think, just looking at it realistically, I think Michigan's going to go blue. I think Pennsylvania's going to go red. So that's what I'm seeing right now. And, we could wake up tomorrow and have a completely different story.
That'd be very interesting if Michigan goes blue and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania both go red. That's against the historical norms.
Yeah, as in 1992, those three states have always voted together since 1992, I believe.
What do you think in Minnesota? I just spoke with Rashina Rashkumar. She's in Minnesota right now, and that state has been interesting because it's been a pretty strong blue state for many, many years. And you got Tim Walz there, the governor of Minnesota. Kamala Harris was very, very active with Tim Walz when it came to the 2020 riots. And, after the killing of George Floyd, he died and the riots broke out. And Kamala Harris injected herself into that state in a very controversial way, because how she injected herself was to say, listen, you violent protesters, I am going to help you get out of jail, as a former prosecutor in the state of California. And so at first she got a lot of support for that. But as I think Minnesotans started to see the ramifications of what was going on because of the violence, it seems that she and Governor Tim Walz, that the support for them was starting to wane a bit, and the businesses have started to flee the Minneapolis downtown area, go out to the suburbs and all that. And it seems now, as I'm looking at the trends in Minnesota, that the political dynamic there is starting to kind of come together again. It's almost like it's a very small gap now between Republicans and Democrats. And I'm not so sure it's going to go blue. I think it will, but there's a chance that listen, they don't like Tim Walz anymore. They don't like Kamala Harris based on what they did in 2020.
Yeah, it very well could. I think when you look at Minnesota, it's a really interesting case study in. Usually when there's a tragedy and you look at, what happened with George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protest in 2020, and what happens when people get all amped up about, something that's, obviously tragic and we don't want to see this happening. And their first response is we need to do something. And then someone like Kamala Harris comes in and says, well, here's the something. We're going to defund the police. We're going to do this and that. And everyone's like, well, that's something. And they jump onto this ideology. And then as time goes on and we see those ideas play out, we're like, oh, well, defunding the police, not such a great idea, right? Deciding to, allow people to, loot and, break into businesses, not a great idea. It's forcing businesses out of the metropolitan area. People start to see that, okay, this wasn't the right idea. We need to go back into some sense of normalcy. And it takes time for people to see that. And that's why I'm thinking Minnesota is, I will say, at risk for the Democrats of flipping back to Republican because of that. People want a return to normalcy, and they don't want to deal with all of the animosity and just pure craziness that's been running about since 2020 there.
Do you think the same thing has happened as time has gone on, as they look at Donald Trump now compared to what the rhetoric has been for the past 8 years on who he is, the characterization by the news media and the Democratic Party that he's this, crazed authoritarian, dictator, Nazi kind of individual? Is that starting to say, okay, we kind of know who he is now?
Yeah.
And they're starting to wake up. That's not who you're mischaracterizing him grossly.
Yeah, anyone that talks about Nazism and the Republican Party need to head back to 1938 to 1942 for a serious history lesson on what that actually means. And to be honest, it's such a gross misrepresentation of a person to compare them to Hitler or a Nazi or something like that. Donald Trump is certainly no moral beacon, and I don't think anyone's going to stand here and defend that. I'd be surprised if they would. He's certainly imperfect in many ways, but how he's been characterized has been largely unfair. And what I would like to see from the left is talk about the issues that really matter. If we really want to dive into foreign policy and economic policy and taxation and tariffs, let's do that. Let's do it in a meaningful way, and let's have that discussion. But just blanket labeling somebody as, you are in this particular hate group or you're racist or whatever, it's just so ridiculous because there's no evidence to support that claim, and it really hurts their cause. And we're seeing that, and we've seen it what happened with Joe Biden and why he's out of the race now. Mm-hmm. And if my suspicions are correct, we're going to see that when we wake up tomorrow morning, and the Democrats are going to take another loss.
Yeah, especially when you're citing a Nazi party that was a socialist party, by the way. There was socialism is what they really globbed onto.
It's just it's a cop out, right? I don't have
it's
anything intellectual.
A lazy argument.
I don't have anything intellectual to say, so I'm going to take the easy way out and just blanket label my opponent because I don't have anything educational or meaningful to say on this topic because I'm lazy and I don't want to do the research.
So the fact that so many people now, in my view, are starting to view Donald Trump differently than they used to, how did that come about? Do you think that, for example, the Joe Rogan podcast and those types of people and the Elon Musks of the world and the RFK Juniors and the Tulsi Gabbards starting to really coalesce around Donald Trump, someone they probably didn't like 8 years ago? Is that part of the process, do you think?
It was really interesting because I think if you take a look at 2017 Trump and 2024 Trump, they're pretty equal. Yeah. But as you get closer to 2020, I think that's where the rails start to fall off for a lot of people, just because of everything that happened around the 2020 election, and it put a bad taste in people's mouth. And I think because Trump couldn't stand up and say, yes, I did lose. There was things that went on that I wasn't a fan of, at the state level, but I did lose. And he obviously left the White House, so there's nothing wrong with admitting that.
Right.
I think that would do him a service to just say that out loud, because it makes a lot of people that are associated with him somewhat uncomfortable because they have to toe the line of yes, it's in contention, but obviously we lost. It's just odd, right? Yeah. But looking at 2017 and 2024, I think that's the Trump that people want to see more in the political arena, specifically in the chair of the commander-in-chief. And looking at the Joe Rogan podcast, this is a really excellent example of something that, last time I looked had 50 million views, 80 million views on X. So you have 130 million views for a 3-hour interview with a former sitting president, and that just doesn't happen. And you really get to know and see somebody over the course of 3 hours because it's harder and harder to hide the longer you talk.
What is it about that? Because it's antithetical to the way that we consume other types of media, because we're big headline kind of culture now. We'll take a little snippet here, a little snippet there, and then we have podcasts come out, and people are willing to sit for 3 hours and watch two people talk. Why? I mean, how does that jive? How does that, considering who we are now as a country, culturally speaking?
Yeah, podcast is the one media form that I would say I have the most knowledge on. And I think for me, when looking at how people feel about long form media compared to short form media, is they want to be told the truth. And it's difficult to discern the truth when you have a headline or a 30-second clip or, a sizzle reel on the 6 o'clock news. They want to actually see somebody for who they are. And what I would have loved to see is a 3-hour interview with Kamala on Joe Rogan and a 3-hour interview with Trump on Joe Rogan. And I think that would have been really eye-opening to the country just to see how deep these policies are, how deep their perspective is, how much they care for the country. Is this for a political power grab, or is this because we actually want to make a difference? And the longer you go in those interviews, the easier it is to discern those things about certain people.
Kamala Harris was invited to go on Joe Rogan's podcast.
She was, and she wanted him to travel to her and do an hour-long. She had, gave him 60 minutes. He had to come to her. And if you know anything about Joe Rogan and his show, he does not travel.
No, I mean he's got his rules. It's the same thing. It's equal access to everybody who wants to come on the program. They all travel. I mean, Elon Musk goes there. Donald Trump goes there. You name the person. Charlie LaDuff, I think he's gone there.
And if anyone wants to say, well, that's unfair, I'll remind you, when Trump was in the White House, Trump interviewed Joe Rogan to come to the White House to interview him at the White House, and Rogan turned him down because he doesn't travel for his podcast.
Okay, but see, from a, if you want to call it marketing or from a strategy perspective, you're Kamala Harris. Mm-hmm. Joe Rogan is going to, you mentioned, 130 million views in this one interview with Donald Trump. You know about that many are going to view you. Why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't you consider that worthy enough? Or is there another reason behind it?
Well, I think the real answer, if everyone is being truthful, Kamala was thrown into this position of running for president. It wasn't really on her bingo card this year. So when that happened, she had a really difficult job, in that she had to distance herself from Joe Biden without trashing the sitting president. Mm-hmm. And she had to come up with economic policies and really just policies for the country that were different than Joe Biden's, but again, not slapping him in the face for what he's done. And she had to distance herself from the administration where she failed on the economy and immigration, yet, pull 180 on all of these very, far left ideologies that she had.
Yes.
And when you add all of those variables into the soup for Kamala, you get a formula where you don't really have any strong policy. And this is me, accurately assessing what's happened in the last 3 months. If you look at town halls and any sort of long form interviews that she had, she's asked honest questions from people or from CNN or from Fox. And her answer immediately is to start attacking Trump.
Yeah.
And the quick reminder is Trump is not the sitting president. You are the sitting vice president, and people want an answer.
Well, I think it also goes back to, I know that she got kind of thrown into this. I think that she wanted to be. And I think this is kind of a long-term strategy, but she's not known for being prepared. Even when she was a senator, her staff was just furious with her because they would brief her, but she wouldn't pay attention to the materials they would hand her as she's going on some overseas trip to meet some somebody that was in charge of some state somewhere else, and she didn't do her homework. Yeah. And I think this is just part of her MO. And I don't know I think, to me, that's why she didn't do the Joe Rogan podcast.
Yeah.
To me, that's why she won't do many town halls. To me, that's why she's turned down many. I don't think she held one press conference as a candidate for the president of the United States. Not one single press conference would she hold, unless she had the questions in advance. Right. So I think that's more. I think that's more to it. She's just not prepared for these things. She doesn't have, as you said, strong policy positions. And if she was honest, she has to be disingenuous right now, because if she's not, she'll lose the election,
right,
based on her far left progressive policies and standpoints.
Yeah, and I think that if the Democrats weren't strapped to the policy where they had to direct the DNC funds to somebody on the ticket, or else they would have potentially lost the money,
right,
we wouldn't have her at the top of the ticket currently.
Yeah.
They would have found someone else.
Yeah, that's a shame. It's a shame that it came out that way, and you have to have somebody who's never won a single primary or a single election in this role as president. She didn't win any of the primaries whatsoever.
No, and there's better candidates on the left that could have represented a more moderate position, and I think would have united more people, but they're not interested in that.
All right, so you've brought up New Hampshire, which I know that you classify that as a battleground state, even though no one else is.
Yeah.
But you're correct. I think the polls were 2-point difference. That's within the margin of error.
Yeah.
So I wonder why they weren't. Typically, they're kind of known as a conservative state is in that part of the country, the Northeast, but a different kind of conservatism compared to Iowa or something like that. But what do you think is going to happen in New Hampshire?
It's interesting. I'm looking at, when I was looking at the numbers before we came in here, I think there was, I can't recall, I think 40% was in, and it was 55-45 for Kamala currently as they're coming in. So the reason why I classified it as battleground is because Trump took it in 16, Biden took it in 20. And the last poll that I looked at, there was a 3.5% spread, and that matched the margin of error. So to me, if there was a swing state that was unannounced, that's the one. And the other unique thing about New Hampshire is that if that was in play for Trump, he would not need Wisconsin, Michigan, or Pennsylvania to win the election. He could take North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, and New Hampshire and get to 272.
That's a major deal. Yeah, right now it's about, you said 44% reported. Those are the number of ballots that have been counted. Trump at 45, and then Kamala Harris 53. But again, it's not even at the halfway point yet. So we'll see what happens there. It would be interesting. I mean, I've always kind of considered New Hampshire as more of a conservative state, but again, a different type of it. Pennsylvania, that is a critical state. Where do you think that's going to go?
I had Pennsylvania going red by 2% in this race, so we'll see if that comes out. I was just looking at the early results. Pittsburgh and Philadelphia have reported largely first.
Yes,
they're going to lean more left. So we'll see. And if it does come down to Pennsylvania, we're going to be waiting a couple days.
How much of a tactical error do you think it was for Kamala Harris not to pick Josh Shapiro from Pennsylvania as her running mate, and she went for Tim Walz instead? Or was it?
No, it was absolutely a terrible idea to ignore Shapiro for several reasons. One, he's a much better orator. He speaks incredibly well. He's seen as a moderate from people on the left and right, and he can be that uniting force. And I think it would have given a lot more of a rounding to that ticket for the left. I think it would have been a much better play. But again, it's... And when she picked Walz, I'll be honest, when Trump picked Vance, that was not who I wanted him to pick. But after sitting down and listening to Vance, and even this is more recent, but he did another 2-3 hours on Rogan, and it was just such a normal guy, such a guy who really cares about the country, and over the last 2 months, I've really changed my opinion on that. And with that, I was like, well, maybe Walz is going to be something similar. We're not the person I would have picked, but maybe I'll change my mind. The more I got to know him, the more I'm like, nope, terrible choice. Should've Shapiro.
Pretty bad.
Yeah,
pretty bad choice.
Yeah, like I don't know who's advising you, but I hope it's not the same people.
Well, so 4 years is say Donald Trump wins. He gets 4 years, and that's it for him.
Yeah.
Do you look at J.D. Vance as the future of the party?
Yeah, I do. I think there's probably 3 contenders in that category for the next iteration of the Republican Party. You have J.D. Vance, you have Ron DeSantis, and you have Vivek Ramaswamy. I think those 3, from a thought leadership and bringing the Republican Party into more of a modern era, I think those would be the 3 leaders that people would look to.
Okay, yeah, I would agree. I think J.D. Vance has been incredibly impressive to me,
and consistent in standing up against the heat, because he has said, like, for example, he was not with Trump in 2016, and he handled that exceptionally well, and was and for everyone listening, the way that you handle things exceptionally well is you be honest, because that honesty really resonates with people. So when he's like, I changed my mind on Trump, and I hope other people do as well, like, what a powerful line.
Yeah, I mean that's what the election depends on too, that people's minds are changed.
Right.
We should all be open to that potentially happening.
And one more thing, Tom, one thing that really frustrates me is when people are like, well, see, this guy changed his mind. He said Trump was bad. Now he says he's good.
Right.
So are we against people changing their minds? Are we against people learning and evolving?
It depends
and
what party they're in, I think.
Well, right, and that's the thing. Like, if someone can make me a really strong argument to, flip parties, and this is why this is going to be better, I'll certainly listen. And I'm not, just married to this one particular, party, but there has to be evidence. There has to be reasoning and justification. And, right now we're just so married to either red or blue. Like, we don't want to listen to the other side.
People change. And in fact, everybody can change, and they do change over time anyway. And when I was a young man, young voter, my first election, I was a Democrat. And then I started to wake up to, okay, I don't really agree. I didn't hate them, but I just didn't agree, I found out, with a lot of their positions on the economy. And for me, it was abortion. It was all these other issues. I thought, well, I don't think that aligns with my core values. Let's look at this other party. And I learned a lot about who Ronald Reagan really was.
Yeah.
Because I was told in my household growing up, he was the most evil person on the planet. And I found out, and actually, he was a pretty good guy. He governed our country pretty well. But again, nobody's perfect, but people do change. And I heard this story the other day a couple days ago from a guy who was speaking publicly about who he became. And when he was a younger man, he did all these types of things. And these are the mistakes I want to be very vulnerable with you about and share these with you. And this is how I changed as a man. I became this individual. Well, a lot of, and this is 20 years back in his history, he went back. Some people came out who were opposed to his political positions and started to claim that he was still doing the same things he did when he was like 16 years old. And he was trying to explain to an audience how you can change morally as an individual. And it was a very wonderful story he explained. But it just shows that people are not, if you did that once, you will always be that way.
Right.
And people change. And I think what J.D. Vance did, I think you're right, he handled it exceptionally well. He explained his reasonings in a very logical way. Here's who I thought he was, but again, I was believing the rhetoric that was coming out of, your mouth, CNN or MSNBC or however it was at the time. I want to get your thoughts on this because to me, it still doesn't compute as to why so many people in this country are so unhappy with the direction of this country and the current leadership, and yet this race seems to be so tight. What do you think the reasons are for that?
I think the reasons are, people, especially if you lean more left, people don't like Donald Trump for particular moral reasons, and that can be, that can be a difficult thing for people to get past and move forward on. So they have to take their default candidate, which in this case would be Kamala, right? And 70% of the country is unhappy with the direction. They're unhappy with what Biden's done with the economy. They're just unhappy with the stagnation. They're unhappy with us continuing to have wars in Ukraine, in Israel. There's just a lot to be unhappy about. And I think for a lot of people, they don't know what the solution is.
Right.
So, so when in doubt, vote party lines. And that's what we're seeing tonight.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate is if people took a look at 2016 or 2017 to 2019 in Trump's presidency, you'd see a major economic upswing. You'd see, a lot more stabilization in the Middle East. And, rhetoric aside and, him, tweeting ridiculous things on the internet, like if you put all that to the side and look at the policy, you'll see something that I think would pull us out of the situation that we're in right now. Is that my first choice in terms of, who I'd have at the top of the Republican ticket? No, but that's a choice that we have. And it's a hell of a lot better of a choice than what's the alternative currently.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very difficult to sift through the noise. But that's why I think you're absolutely right. I think podcasts, like we're doing here now, are a way for people to get to know others on a more genuine level.
Yeah.
It's very easy to be disingenuous when you've got your partisan talking points or you have a soundbite here and there, and that's all the reporter wants. They get it, they wrap it up, and they put it on the 11 o'clock news. A lot different than sitting here for 2, 3, 4 hours and explaining who you are and answering questions. That's why I love the Joe Rogan experience and what Donald Trump and J.D. Vance did and Kamala Harris did not do. She should have. I think it was a tactical mistake. But then again, maybe it wasn't because she's doing what Joe Biden did in 2020. He didn't go out and speak to the media.
Right.
COVID was the excuse back then.
Yep.
Now the excuse is, well, I only got a few months to campaign and I would think the opposite approach would have been the more effective choice. But there's a reason behind it. I just don't think she's capable of doing it.
Yeah, and another thing too to mention about Rogan is he did another interview that wasn't talked about as much because he did Trump, Vance, and Elon Musk in 9 days.
Yeah.
So that's quite the lineup. But he also had Senator Fetterman from Pennsylvania on.
Oh.
And that was dropped, right in the middle of all of that, and it was I think 2.5 hours. And again, another great interview, and you really get to understand his policies, what he votes on, how his views on immigration, and you get to really see, like, in my opinion, where a lot of those ideologies fall apart and where the logic isn't fully thought through. And again, that 2-hour window of really getting to talk to someone and hear them out, incredibly valuable. And if anyone's saying, well, Rogan's just putting all these darlings of the right on, you're not watching a show.
No.
That's not what he does. And the way he interviews people is rare, and that's why I think he has the best podcast.
I agree. He's phenomenal, and he does put out the invitation to all sorts of people.
Of
And a
course.
reminder, he put it out to Kamala Harris, and she essentially turned it down because she knew that he wasn't going to go out to D.C. and sit down with her based on those stipulations that she put forward. Rob Johnson, always good to see you. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, my friend.
CEO of Wayne Radio. All right, we're going to play some a video of Donald Trump last night in Grand Rapids. He spoke a lot. The first tape we played was him just kind of talking to the crowd, ad-libbing with them, and just speaking from his heart. No prompter in that particular session, that first part of it. I want to play a little bit what he had to say about certain policy positions that he holds and subscribes to, and he says that he's going to implement if he wins this election. Take a look.
And our country's going down the drain. We're going to turn our country around. I will end inflation very quickly. You know how we're going to end it? By drilling and drilling and drill. Energy is going to bring everything down. Energy is going to bring it down. And I will stop the invasion of criminals coming across our border. I will strengthen our military. I will restore peace in the world. And I will rescue the American dream. We're going to have the American dream back soon. Together, we will begin the 4 greatest years in the history of our country. And we will launch the most extraordinary economic boom the world has ever seen. If you vote for Lion Kamala, you will have 4 more years of misery, failure, and disaster our country may never recover from. I don't believe that our country can take any more of this without just gone. I don't believe it can take any more. It's going to be, can't take this. This is abnormal abuse, And I heard somebody said the wall. I built 571 miles of wall, which is much more than I said I was going to build. And you know, it really worked. Walls work. 2 things work. What are the 2 things? Walls and wheel. They're the only 2 things that never get obsolete, right? Walls and wheels. A wall and a wheel. It's always going to be around. Other things, they have the beautiful computers. You know, you buy a computer. Oh, this is the greatest. 2 weeks later, it's obsolete. That goes on. I don't know how people do it. We have the king of computers. We have the king of everything endorsed me, Elon Musk. And he brought that rocket ship down 2 weeks ago. I never said 22 stories. It's like monster. You don't know, is it big or small? It's a monster. 22 stories. And you know that story. I've told it a couple of times. I love the story because I really, the best part is I'm talking to one of the most important guys in the world, and I say, wait a minute, could I just watch something? I see something on I have the television muted, right? I'm looking at this crazy rocket, and I saw it leaving a little while before, and it was all beautiful white. Now it's absolutely burned to a crisp. You know, it goes 10,000 miles an hour. The heat is at levels that nobody can experience. So it's a little, you know, rough. It's a little rough on the paint job. And it's coming in, and I'm watching, and I'm holding this very important person, one of the most important people. But you know, when you were the president, and now it's very possible, like maybe 95%, that you're going to be the president again, they hold. No, they hold. So I say, do you mind holding for a minute? I have to see this. And I put the phone down. That guy was holding like for an hour and a half. He never got off the phone. I wish he would have hung up. I would have felt better. Because I picked up the phone later. I said, oh, wow. Hello? Hello? He goes, hello. Anyway, but it was so exciting. So I'm watching it. And this monstrous thing is going down, right? And it's coming down. It's, first of all, it's doing all sorts of flips up in the air. I would not want to be on that sucker. I don't care how good Elon is. I said, Elon, you wouldn't get me in that ship under any circumstances. But it's coming down, it's a little rough, and now all of a sudden it starts to slow down as it gets to the ground. Then it starts to move over. Then it gets a little bit out of control, it looks like. A little out of, and the left part of the bottom is going to just rip that big gantry. That's this, you know, whatever the hell it is that holds it. And it's coming in. Oh, and I didn't know it was Elon's. I just assumed, you know, he loves this stuff. He's in a class. But it's coming in and it's going to rip the gantry. I say, oh, this is bad. This is going to be bad. I close my eyes. All of a sudden, wow, you have this massive flame coming out of the left-hand side of the bottom. It was this big jet engine. It pushes it away, and it's coming down, and then it settles into a plate, and then those arms grab it like you grab your baby, just like you grab your little baby. And it hugged it and just put it down, and there it was. There it was. And I called Elon. I said, was that you? He said, yes. And he said, and by the way, he said this, and by the way, this is something I'd never said because I didn't even think of it before when I told this story. He said, and by the way, I'm heading up to Pennsylvania to campaign for you. That was 2 weeks ago. He's still there. Can you believe it? Because he considers the election more important than rockets, more important than anything. He helped us out a lot in North Carolina and parts of Georgia where they desperately needed the Starlink. I had no idea what Starlink. They called me up. They called me up in Georgia. Elon's incredible. He has Starlink. He's got everything has to do with stars and stuff. Very complex stuff. No, he's amazing. But, sir, I know that you know Elon Musk because I read your endorsement. You know, he says the most important endorsement he'll ever make. It was such a nice thing, and he said he wants to help. And I didn't know he was going to help to this extent. He went up. He won the big case today, too. He won the case. Huh? Because I don't know, he did something that I don't know what he was doing, but he did something with lotteries, and you know, he's in a different. He's amazing. You're gonna do lotteries and this and that and make your life fun, and he's having a good time. You know, he usually is in a lab, and he's happy there. All of a sudden, he's escaped the lab, and now he's out, and the public adores him. He's a great guy. The public absolutely adores him. But the man from North Carolina, great guy. You know, North Carolina was hit so hard with the water. The hurricane was essentially a massive pile of water. It was a big water hurricane, the biggest we've ever had. And they were so flooded. Areas that had never virtually seen water would turn out to be lakes. They ripped houses, trees. Everything was ripped down by the power of the tides that were going back and forth. It was terrible. And this man said, if you could ask him for help with Starlink, we cannot get it. It's very hard to get. And I called Elon, and he got it immediately for them. He got it so much that he had it there immediately, so much that you know, they couldn't even believe it. He said, this has saved a lot of lives. They had no communication in North Carolina, which, by the way, we're leading. In fact, somebody said, they picked up stakes. There's no more ads. There's no more. That's usually a good sign. That's usually a sign that they're not going to win. But one of the reasons they're not going to win is because FEMA did such a bad job. So FEMA, you know, we had a great FEMA. We did good. But they spent most of their money, as you know, on illegal migrants coming in. They spent so much money that they didn't have the money to take care of the people from North Carolina. But we will be there on January 20th, because on January 20th, that's when you assume it. But they pulled up stakes. Historically, when you pull up stakes and stop advertising and leave, historically, you're in pretty good shape in this state. Is that correct politically? Because I haven't done this as long as some of the as well and as long as, well, I think I've done it better, actually, because I ended up being president, so I probably, but some of our great politicians have done this for a lot longer than me. So let me ask you, all of these senators, and when you pull up stakes and leave, historically, Doug Burgum was so incredible. He really is, isn't he? Is he a class act? His wife is much better. She blows him away, right? Catherine is much better. But, Doug, when you pull up stakes and you stop advertising, doesn't that generally mean that it's over, right? It's over. Doug is cautious. He doesn't want to, he thinks it's a trick question. No, it means it's over. And I think it's over in a lot of places. I think we're going to see some incredible stuff tomorrow. But it won't matter. It won't matter as long as you go out and vote. Nothing's going to matter because it's in our, you know the expression, the ball is in their hands, the ball is in our hands. They can't do a thing about it. And now you're going to go out there later today. And you're going to show us something. And vote for me, and I will deliver rising wages, soaring incomes, and a colossal surge of jobs. We're going to use things. What's the most beautiful word in the dictionary? We're going to create wealth, opportunity for Americans of every race, religion, color, and creed. But I have to tell you one quick story, because I'm so proud. They're going to build this great big plant. They're building it. They're going to build it. China's going to build a plant, and it's going to destroy Michigan, destroy it, destroy Detroit. Everyone's going to move out. And I heard about it through a friend of mine that builds plants. That's what he does. He builds plants. He builds them better than anybody. John, let's just call him John. And he was sitting there, and I was at the Economic Club of Detroit a couple of weeks ago. But I told John a year ago, I want to see a plant. And he said, well, I'll have to take you to Mexico. I said, I don't want to see a plant. I want to see a plant here. I want a big one. He said, we don't really do too many big ones in the United States anymore. I said, what is that all about, Mexico? He said, well, China's building some of the biggest plants anywhere in the world. They're building them in Mexico. And I said, well, I'm not happy about that. I don't want to see the damn plant in Mexico. It wouldn't look right if I'm in Mexico looking at plants. Do we agree, sir? It wouldn't look right. And so he said, all right, look, I say, forget it. Then I thought about it, and I was making the speech in Detroit, and I said, a couple of weeks before, I said, if they want to build a plant in Mexico owned by China so that they can save all of the costs associated with bringing their cars and all of the things, I'm going to put 100% tariff on every single car coming out of that plant. And if that's not enough, I'll make it 200, 300, 500, 800. I don't give a damn what it is. And they're not going to have one car made in that plant that ever crosses that border, which is right next to them. Anyway, so I see John in the audience, and I gave them that notice a little before, and it was public. And I see him, and I send my people. I say, after I speak, make sure he comes to the back. I want to see him backstage. So I see John. I say, John, how's that big monster plant that's going to rip apart our country, but it's going to hurt South Carolina, Tennessee, and all the other places that do a lot of cars. It's going to hurt everybody. It's going to hurt the country. How is that plant doing? He said, sir, they've given it up because they think you're going to win, and they think you're going to tariff them, and they think they're going to lose their share. And sir, they've given up that plant. It's not going to be built anymore. So I saved Michigan and I saved Detroit, and we're going to let them build that plant. But you know where we want them to build it? Right here we want them to build it. And then they won't have any tariffs to pay.
Yeah, see, that's the thing. That was Donald Trump last night, Grand Rapids, Michigan, where he ended his campaign after all those months and years, the same place he entered it in 2016 when he went to victory. In Michigan, I'll just mention this quickly, then I want to show you another state that just got called for Donald Trump, but it's very, very tight in Michigan. Only 17% are reporting, but it's 48 to 49. Trump at 48, Kamala Harris at 49. Let's put up the state of Utah that has just been called for Donald Trump from the decision desk. So right now it's well, they're not showing how many votes have been counted as of yet, but it's 6 electoral votes in the state of Utah. And it looks like in Nevada, there's a lot of hope and there's a lot of belief that Donald Trump's going to take that state as well. Virginia, this is incredibly close, and Donald Trump is leading in Virginia. It's 49 to 48. If Donald Trump wins Virginia, he's almost guaranteed the victor in this race. So we're waiting for that. There's been some rumblings out that they're about to call North Carolina for Donald Trump, again, one of the battleground states, because in North Carolina, I mean, I'm surprised they haven't called it as of yet. Some outlets have. The one that I'm following has not just yet. But they've got 70% reported In North Carolina, Donald Trump at 52%, Kamala Harris at 46. So it is more than likely, depending on maybe these other counties that have not yet fully reported, that Donald Trump might win the state of North Carolina too. If he does that, he's very close to taking this election. Right now, where it stands, the electoral vote count, Donald Trump at 205 and Kamala Harris at 117. And that might sound like a big difference, but remember, California has not been counted. That's got the most electoral votes at 54. Oregon and Washington as well. And again, those other battleground states. Minnesota, we're watching that. Wisconsin, it's going to be a tough one. And of course, in the state of Michigan, where that might go towards Kamala Harris. But again, Donald Trump is speaking about the tariffs there. And I know there are a lot of conservatives who do not like this idea of tariffs. But he just explained why it works. That China was about to build the biggest auto plant in the world in Mexico in order to prevent the expensive, hiring American workers to build cars in America. So they're going to build this plant in Mexico and then ship all the cars across the border into whatever, San Diego or in Texas or in Arizona, and then sell them in the United States. And he says, no, if you do that, you're going to, it's 100% tariff, maybe 200. And they said, okay, we're not going to do it now. We're going to build the plant in the United States. They've already agreed to do that, and that's without Donald Trump being president of the United States as of yet. So it's too close to call. We're still waiting on that. I want to bring in Patrick Kolbeck. Patrick Kolbeck used to be in, of course, the state legislature in Michigan, the battleground state, and he ran for governor against Gretchen Whitmer back in 2018. But he's analytical mind. He's been tracking the way the elections have been processed and counted over the past few election cycles, and he's brought up an amazing slew of, you can call them accusations or claims about how these elections have been rigged over time, but more often than not, he's been proven correct. A lot of these judges coming back and say, actually, yeah, Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary of State, you're not allowed to do that legally. That's against the law, for one, and it may open up the elections to fraud. Let's bring him in. Patrick Kolbeck joining me here on Tom Jordan Live. Patrick, it's good to see you. Good to talk to you.
Good to be with you. Well, you know the difference between a conspiracy theory and a conspiracy fact, right?
What's that?
6 months.
Yes, exactly. Right. That's the case. That was the joke about 2 years ago when all these things were coming to pass, and still people refuse to believe. And listen, I spoke to Nolan Finley with the Detroit News, and even he's very much against the claim that there is any fraud in these elections in 2020. That there certainly wasn't enough fraud to have overturned that election. But he now
sure
is
he did an exhaustive investigation.
Yes,
in support of that
yes,
claim,
I'm
right?
sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure he did. He doesn't like the rhetoric and all that kind of stuff. But now he's boldly proclaiming that what Jocelyn Benson is now doing has opened up the floodgates for fraud to occur based on these laws and these things that she and the Democratic legislature are now putting in, because of Proposal 2 is now, a state. It's in the state constitution, these amendments that open up the floodgates to fraud, something you've been talking about and warning about for many years now.
Nolan is spot on. It's exactly what she's done. She's essentially, remember the Wizard of Oz with that curtain that the wizard operated behind? What she's done is put that, not only she have a curtain, she has a lockbox, she has she put it on another island. She's done everything she possibly can to make sure that we cannot peek behind that curtain to see how our elections are run. And that's just creating the conditions for fraud. They're eliminating transparency in our state.
Completely. And it was already a pretty non-transparent state. But I want to, one of the things we could look at like immediately, and Ruth Johnson came out and put this out in a press release the other day. Ruth Johnson, the former Secretary of State of Michigan, so she knows what she's talking about. And there are 35,000 newly registered voters that the Social Security Administration cannot find out anything about them whatsoever, meaning that the people now in the voter rolls, 35,000 newly registered voters within that 14-day window, they can't be vetted nor verified because they can't find their Social Security numbers or their identities. And yet they're still probably going to be allowed to vote without any consequences as a result of that. Did you hear about this? And if so, what were your thoughts on it?
Are you just trying to deny people their right to vote? Is that what I'm hearing,
Yes,
Tom? I mean,
I
that's the
am
rhetoric we're
actually.
hearing on all this. No, we're trying to get a lawful election. There's certain criteria that needs to be satisfied when you're vetting somebody's eligibility to vote. And I saw this back in 2020 where they were entering voter birth dates with 1/1/1900 on it, and they said, "Oh, that's just a placeholder." Well, then how are you verifying the age of that voter and whether or not they're eligible to receive a ballot? You're not. So no, this is another mechanism of fraud that they're using in all too many cases, and it's got to stop.
Yeah, because now we also have that 500,000 individuals on the voter rolls currently that will not be taken off, not fully until the plan is at least 2027 after Jocelyn Benson runs for governor in 2026. Do you think this is just, as you said, as you've been saying all along, that this is just a way for the Democrats to get in power and to stay in power?
Absolutely. Once you let the criminals in the door to make the laws, then you have laws that are friendly to criminals. That's why the old legal expression "fraud vitiates everything" is so important. And that's why I've been so adamant and like a broken record still on 2020, because unless you address that, you don't fix anything. So back to that 500,000 number though that
Yes.
you had there,
Yeah.
and let's dissect her narrative a little bit. I got a good friend of mine that's very good at analyzing large data sets, like our qualified voter file in Michigan, and he went off and analyzed the voter rolls to see if Jocelyn Benson's NVRA compliance statement, actually that's National Voting Rights Act compliance, which it says that you're supposed to be put on inactive rolls. You haven't gone off and voted in 2 elections, then you're taken off. He said, well, let's see if she's actually complying with that fully. And he actually analyzed that there's over 70,000 people that she should have taken off last cycle that she didn't, but she kept on there. So she's just given window dressing to everybody. When you actually crank the numbers, pretty much everything that comes out of Jocelyn's mouth is need to be fact checked by real fact checkers, not the Facebook fact checkers.
Well, what's highly concerning to me, because I mean, it's one thing to say, "Oh, there's no fraud; you're making it up." It's another thing to actively pursue people who are claiming there was fraud, as if they're actually committing a crime here. And this kind of speech is dangerous. This is disinformation, and now the government needs to come in and look into this individual and see what kind of a threat this person poses to democracy. And that's what
Yeah.
Jocelyn Benson, in partnership with the Attorney General of the state, Dana Nessel, and partnership with the news media, are actively doing right now. And I've brought this up before, but I've got one of those letters that says, listen, if somebody puts out disinformation regarding the integrity of the election, you are to note that person, take a photo of that person if possible, and of the information that they gave you, and send it to my office, and we'll take it from there. I mean, to me, that's a pretty scary scenario, and it reeks of authoritarianism.
I've gotten more than letters. I've actually had visitors from special agents from the Attorney General's office come over to my home.
From the Attorney General's office.
Yeah.
What did they want?
They were claiming that they're obviously monitoring everything I'm doing. At the time, I was managing a website where one of the documents had a copy of the state emblem that was up there. I didn't put it up there, but I got rid of it as it was up there. But this is one of those things that's usually done with a phone call or an email or a letter, right? And they decided to send over 2 special agents to send a message. And also, when I was out at the Wayne County clerk's office back in the 2022 primary, I was a certified poll challenger. I wanted to go off and witness the aggregation of the votes at the county level in that election, and I was denied access. In order to make sure that I couldn't go in there, they had a deputy sheriff monitoring me. They had 2 special agents from the Attorney General's office, and they had 2 Detroit police officers from the police tactical unit all there to make sure that I stayed in my place outside in the hall, and was not able to witness how they actually pulled together the ballot. So
Can you
it's about
explain why
intimidation.
that is such a big deal? Explain to people who maybe don't understand why they're not allowed to do that. In fact, Michigan state law allows poll challengers to come in and observe. You're observing the count to make sure that nothing nefarious is going on. And
Yep.
so I guess what I don't understand, and never did, I didn't understand this back in 2020 either, is why these sheriff's deputies and these police officers, I mean, who gives them the authority to identify you or anyone else like you who is just observing what's going on, the right to kick you out of the building?
Well, under MCL 168-733, that's where poll challenger rights are defined, and it gives us authority to operate to oversee any procedures related to the election and ensure compliance with the law. Now, Dana Nessel, and when you wonder about why the police officers, law enforcement officers aren't aware of any of this, Dana Nessel sent out a little note to all of the law enforcement agencies throughout the state. And in that note, she cited all the election law that she wanted enforced during the upcoming election. Well, all that election law focused on voter rights and on election official rights, and it completely ignored poll challenger rights, which are statutory rights. And so what police officers know very well are, disturbance of the peace. If somebody's creating a ruckus, then you go off and arrest them and escort them out of the premise. So they're very comfortable with that. They're not trained on poll challenger rights, and they don't understand that. So what Nessel did effectively with that letter was tee up conflict, because I'm going in as a duly certified poll challenger. I know what the law says. I will complain vociferously if I'm removed from the premise for trying to execute those rights. And they will cite it because they've only been told one side of the story. They will assume that I'm just disturbing the peace and I need to get out of there because I'm interfering with the elections. No, that's not the case. I'm just trying to oversee the elections. And, it's just one example, like you were talking about, with the lack of transparency. And I couldn't agree with Nolan more. I mean, he gets it that they're deliberately removing all the oversight of our elections. And I've witnessed that firsthand, and a lot of other meddling kids in the state have witnessed it firsthand, unfortunately, as well.
Yeah, and I do think that because, Nolan he wrote a column about it in the Detroit News regarding these new laws that have been implemented, and Jocelyn Benson's really the reason why there's so many people now coming out and doubting the integrity of the election, who now she kind of demonizes and says you can't say that when she's actively doing it. But I do think, so Nolan's one individual, but there's other people that were there at the TCF Center back in 2020 who are part the count. And some back then were saying, no, there wasn't anything nefarious going on. There wasn't any fraud taking place, who have now come out and said, actually, I was wrong back then. And looking back and now seeing what I'm seeing today, yeah, there's been plenty of fraud that had occurred. Are you noticing that as well, that people are starting to open their eyes a little bit more to this?
Yeah, and you can actually see it with the way they've changed the election system in the city of Detroit. They've gotten rid of some of the more suspect vote tabulation methods that they had previously and some of the practices that they had. But I was there. I was a poll challenger at TCF Center during the 2020 election. So I was there literally for over a marathon shift from 6 p.m. on election night all the way through 6 p.m. the next day, pretty much. And so I was there when they had the 3:30 a.m. drop off of ballots without any chain of custody.
Mm-hmm.
I was there as a certified Microsoft small business specialist, looking at the tabulators and the adjudication workstations and confirming that the machines were indeed connected to the internet. And then I was there when I was one of the people barred from re-entry into the AV counting board due to bogus COVID rules at the time that they were counting military ballots, and they had put pizza boxes up on the window to prevent oversight of that process. So yeah, all that stuff's been proven true. I mean, they didn't believe us about the van coming up at the back of the TCS Center. It took the Gateway Pundit to go off and issue a FOIA request for the surveillance video before people started believing that we were telling the truth.
Yeah, and it's amazing. And the Gateway Pundit is a great publication, but now they're being pursued as well, and all sorts of lawfare going against them and these frivolous lawsuits because they're a journalism outfit trying to write stories, and now the government is actively trying to take them down as well. It's horrendous. You think about these.
Why that's happening? That's actually part of the plan. And if you go to millennialmillie.com, they actually were running simulations prior to the 2020 election that said, if things don't go the way we want, or if things do go the way we want to make sure we make an example out of anybody who pops up and starts pushing a narrative counter to our best interests. And they actually talked specifically about making sure that these people would not have any livelihood. I mean, I work with Mike Lindell. I mean, you want to talk about somebody that's been targeted for speaking his mind regarding the elections. I mean, it's Mike. So this was actually part of their plan, and it's to make sure that they play whack-a-mole with us until we submit into silence. And thankfully,
Taking
there's a lot of people that
taking
are,
away people's livelihoods is what they have been doing. You brought up a
yes,
very once rich man, Mike Lindell, been doing it with him, and then you bring up the Gateway Pundit. They're trying to bankrupt the Gateway Pundit.
yep,
I have been told, and
and
I wonder
the
what your
lawyers,
thoughts are.
yeah,
I've been told specifically by news outlets I worked with. You're not allowed to talk about election fraud. Specifically, you cannot talk about it because they'll say, we know it's all been adjudicated and the courts have proven there was no fraud whatsoever. And I'll say, that's not true, actually. And I'll give them the reasons why it's completely false. And the courts wouldn't even look at a lot of the evidence that exists. And it hasn't been adjudicated. And there's tremendous amount of fraud. It's okay to say that without being labeled a conspiracy theorist. But the news outlets, and you know this probably more than anybody else who's not in a newsroom. I know it because I worked in a newsroom and I've been directed not to talk about this. And now I'm free. I can talk about it finally after all these years. But you're being sought after by these so-called reporters claiming what you're saying is completely false and conspiracy. And I'm pretty certain I know why they're doing it because they are not allowed to talk about it as well. If their newsroom was anything like mine and many others around the country. So what do you
it's
say?
actually
I
more
mean, what do you
insidious than that. Yeah.
go ahead? Well, tell me how more insidious are they?
And this isn't just me saying this. You remember the congressional report that was put out by the Weaponization of Government Committee
Yes.
about an organization called the Election Integrity Partnership. By the way,
Yes.
they also had a sister organization called the Virality Project. They were focused on misinformation regarding COVID. So this Election Integrity Partnership, its purpose was to silence people and
Yes.
censor discussion of these stories. And this isn't just conjecture. This isn't just me getting, not the number of likes that I want to see on Twitter or Facebook or anything. They've got internal emails from these organizations highlighting how they actually set up an incident reporting tool through the Center for Internet Security. And they had 4 different stakeholder groups that worked actively to censor Americans on topics that they didn't want to talk about. And so, for example, an incident would be like, hey, Colbeck says these machines are connected to the internet. Oops, there's going to be a 4 a.m. talking point where they get all their fact checkers working and they go off and flag that as an incident, route it out to their folks at big tech, which included Twitter at the time and Facebook and Instagram and all the usual suspects. And then they would route it out to the big media folks and they'd say, okay, anytime you hear somebody saying this, or this, it's false news, it's fake information, it's misinformation, disinformation. Your talking point, your counter is this, and this. And they've got this documented. They've got them. And what's really serious about this is that the 4 stakeholder groups, one of those stakeholder groups is the federal government that under the First Amendment is explicitly prohibited from engaging in censorship of free speech.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what they were doing. So no, it's by design, and this Election Integrity Partnership is at the center of it.
That's amazing. Yeah, what a name too, a misnomer for sure. It's manipulation, it's coercion, it's mandated speech, and it's happening in our newsrooms around the country. The freedom of the press. No, there's no more freedom of the press in my view, based on what I've seen and what you've experienced.
Yeah.
A lot of other Americans have experienced as well. So that all being said, it is election night, and the votes are being tallied up here. Michigan right now, we're looking at about 22% of the tally in. It's got Donald Trump at 48.96, 49%, Kamala Harris at 49.27. In a state that you have already said and explained is very non-transparent. How do you foresee, do you think the election results tonight can be trusted?
I've been very open saying that no matter what the results are, we need to do a proctology exam on our election system. There's a project that I've posted out at the Election Crime Bureau called the Election Confidence Project, and I'm calling for an audit of all 50 states, regardless of whether or not Kamala is given the keys to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue or Donald Trump is, because you'll recall in 2016, Hillary complained that the election was stolen. In 2020, Donald Trump and myself and others complained that the election's stolen. We got to stop this stolen ping pong match going on and get to the bottom of it, start securing the elections, get to prioritize transparency over these machines. We need to get rid of the machines, go to hand counts of paper ballots, have transparent voter registration, rolls, and let's just get back down to basics, guys. We used to do this all the time in elections. This isn't rocket science by any stretch of the imagination. Back before Common Core math, we used to know how to add numbers without a machine.
Common Core. Yeah, that was George W. Bush, I think, administration
Yeah.
putting that in. Let's fix, what is it in your website? Let's fix stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of materials on election fraud at letsfixstuff.org, but I also want to point people to electioncrimebureau.com. That's part of our effort with Mike Lindell. We've got something called the real-time election monitoring system, which is something I didn't have back in 2020. Now I'm happy to say we do have now, which is when you have an election fraud incident, instead of texting it, emailing it, just throwing it on some generic social media platform, go to trackincidents.com, use Mike Lindell's Vocal app, capture it as an incident. Then we can show a heat map of all those incidents out at electionnexus.com. And it's live right now. You can look at it. We're capturing these incidents all over the country and just encourage people to participate. So instead of just generically tweeting it out or just telling somebody about the water cooler, do something about it. Put it out use the Vocal app, get an account there, post it there, and then we're going to go through all those items. And for the ones that we think merit a criminal investigation, we're going to direct you to law enforcement and package that incident as a complaint that you can use and hopefully get some action out of it, not just a bunch of venting.
Yeah. Yeah, too much venting going on and not enough action, and hopefully this solves the issue. We sure would like that to be the case because I think more people are realizing, okay, this is something that is more of a crisis than we realize. Thanks so much. Patrick Kolbeck joining me, and we'll talk some more and wish you all the best. I know you're busy tonight, so I appreciate the time you gave me. Thank you.
Oh, the night's still young. Yeah, thank you very much. God bless you, Tom. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, Patrick, God bless you as well. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. All right, a little update real quick on some of these battleground states. And I'm going to go back to Rashini Rajkumar in just a second here, but want to go through this real fast as we're looking at the state of Minnesota. It's 49 to 49%. Boy, it is tight in Michigan, battleground state. Kamala Harris looks like she's ahead by a quarter of a point in Michigan. That's with only about 23% of the votes being counted at this point. Well, I just lost my page here, so we'll just leave it at that. I want to go to Minnesota, look at that real quick, because as we're going to talk with Rashini Rajkumar, this is very interesting there it's only about 4% reported, but Donald Trump in Minnesota, I would assume these are the rural counties first that are being counted because he's up in Minnesota right now, 59% to Kamala Harris's 38%. That's a significant margin, but again, very early in the state of Minnesota. Let's bring her in right now. Rashini Rajkumar is back with us. Rashini, good to see you. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Yeah, good to be with you, Tom. What a hot night. I've been looking up some different numbers here, and I'll give you some numbers from the NBC affiliate here in Minneapolis, KARE 11. I've been tracking their numbers on their live with 7% reporting. So again, not a lot. We've got Donald Trump in Minnesota, which I did not think I would be saying this to you really at all tonight, almost 59% to Kamala Harris's 38%. Again, only 7% reporting. But you're right. When I look at the different congressional races around the state, the two districts that I'm not seeing any numbers are Minneapolis and St. Paul, and then one more suburban district. But otherwise, pretty much all of the outstate districts are showing are leaning in the red. More of them are in the red. One of our House districts, District number 2, Angie Craig versus Joe Tyrab, is leaning toward Angie Craig, the Democrat. But interesting to note, lately, the last couple of weeks, Angie Craig had some ads showing her support of the police police and sheriff's deputies were in the ad with her endorsing her. And I thought, that's a smart move because in the state of Minnesota, regardless of whether you're a Democrat or Republican, you want safety. So that was a really good strategic move by Angie Craig, the Democrat.
Absolutely. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier tonight about how the shift in this defund the police movement has really, I think, brought to light the importance of law enforcement, and particularly in Minneapolis and the like. I found it interesting, too, that Amy Klobuchar is still down. What is it, 45% to Royce White's 51%. So if this holds up, again, it's only in this case, I think it's only about 4% reporting.
Yeah.
You said it's 7%? Is that what you?
I've got about 7% according to KARE 11. Yes, Royce White at 51%, Amy Klobuchar at 45%. But keep in mind, I mean, that is huge for someone of Amy Klobuchar's name recognition and stature. And she has done a lot in the United States Senate. And she really, whether it was the Kavanaugh hearings and you saw her as one of the questioners, various things, she was on stage when Tim Walz was getting named as the vice presidential nominee. She has done some things with the Harris-Walz campaign. So she's had a lot of national attention even in the last couple months. So that's interesting. And I think it's also partly because of Royce White's name recognition as a former pro basketball player. My husband, who's from Iowa originally, believes it's because he's an Iowa State grad, but I told my husband that's probably not the main reason.
Probably not, although I understand your husband's bias in that. Several months ago, when I was on my old platform, you and I talked about Royce White and the attractiveness of him in terms of a candidate in the state of Minnesota and going up a strong candidate like Amy Klobuchar. What is it about him, other than the fact that he went to Iowa State? What is it about Royce White that seems to be really catching on? I've seen some of his very intriguing speeches and the way he interacts with the folks in Minnesota there. But what is it that the people there like so much about this guy?
One of the things that is so amazing about just humanity is you can't predict it. And we are in an era where mental health is a hot topic. Royce White needed to leave the NBA. Well, he was having mental health issues in the NBA. He went to the NBA, wanted to get help. And I'm paraphrasing anecdotally, and was kicked out. So the NBA was not at all in support of getting him the help that he needed. And that was then. This is now. Think about all the athletes, the young athletes even, who are using their platforms to bring more attention to mental health. So he was of an era that wasn't supporting that, but because of that name recognition and his past as a pro athlete, I'm guessing that's playing into this right now, Tom.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I've liked what I've seen of him. I don't know a lot about him, but I agree with your husband. He seems like a good guy and probably a great basketball player back then. So talk about this blue wall. I mean, Minnesota I still consider it a blue state, even though I know it borders the Dakotas, North and South Dakota, which are very, very conservative and very red, but then it borders on the other side of it, Wisconsin. But at this point, there's a strong chance that Donald Trump might take the state of Wisconsin. Yeah, it's about 50% to Kamala Harris's 48. And then Michigan, it's pretty much neck and neck, 49 Trump to 48 Kamala Harris. Do you think it's a connection between those states there, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, in terms of the ideology and the way they see things from their worldview politically?
I really don't. But here's the thing. I might have a bit of a skewed vision because I am sitting here in the more urban part of the state of Minnesota. And when we think about the outstate parts of Minnesota, which we're talking about kind of, if you think about the very high numbers and the low numbers. So we have 8 congressional districts, 1 and 2, 7 and 8, and 6 are kind of out in a little more outstate, exurban and outstate. And those are the districts that touch upon both of the Dakotas, Wisconsin, and Iowa to our south. And so when you think about what's happening right now, Wisconsin really being neck and neck, Michigan looking like it will probably go to Kamala Harris, the Dakotas already being called for Donald Trump. You can see how there's such a difference in the state of Minnesota because of our very large urban population in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, which is nearly about 4 million people. So in our state of 10 electoral votes, 4 million of that population is Minneapolis, St. Paul, and it's 90 or so suburbs and exurbs, if you want to call them that. So I am stunned. I never really thought I'd live to see the day that I'm sitting here saying to you, Minnesota could go red for the president. I mean, again, let's think back to 1984, as I mentioned when I was on with you earlier, when Minnesota and DC were the only places that went for Democrat Walter Mondale. Those were the two at the time. I even remember, Tom, we didn't have red and blue then. If I remember correctly, we had blue and yellow. And Minnesota and DC, I was watching it that night with my parents. It was yellow. The one yellow state amidst the rest of the country was blue for the opponent. So that's really kind of my memory as a preteen of the
Yeah.
1984 election.
I remember that election very well, and I don't remember the yellow part of it, but I do remember Walter Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro. That was her name. She was the vice presidential candidate with
Nominee.
Walter Mondale back then, going up against a very strong Ronald Reagan for Ronald Reagan's second term, of course, which you won. But I don't think I was preteen. I think I was teen at that point. But yeah,
You
that
were
was
young.
yeah, I was young.
Yeah, you don't remember the yellow because you were in the blue part of the whole country. We
I
were the
was.
only yellow state in the middle, and then
Yeah,
DC over there on the other
yeah.
side of the map.
Very interesting what's happened over the years. Think from 1984 to now, the political shift in the landscape in the Midwest as well. I always, before I moved to the Midwest, thought, the flyover country was what they called it, was all red and all very conservative. And no, that's not the case. And you look at Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, and certainly Illinois being another very liberal state. Explain the dynamics. Okay, so Minneapolis, and I don't think they've been counted yet. Correct? Minneapolis, St. Paul.
No, I
They're
mean
they're
the
number.
congressional districts, I'm not seeing anything, like not even 1%. And guess what? It's the same time zone as the rest of the state, but not even
Yeah.
1, 2, or 3% are showing up
Hmm.
in the third, fourth, and fifth districts, congressional districts for the state of Minnesota. And I'm really uncertain as to why that is.
Well, it's interesting, and there is as you mentioned, a big dynamic and a disparity between the Twin Cities in that area versus like Alexandria, St. Cloud, and the more the outskirts on the way to Fargo, North
Yes.
Dakota. All right, and I only said those names to show you I knew some people in Minnesota. All right,
Yeah.
so
Good,
let's talk about
good
some of these
name
other
calling.
all these other battleground states, and I don't know how much from Minnesota you've been watching, but there's Arizona right now, and that is also they've got about 50% of the votes counted already in the state of Arizona, and it is a tie, 49% to 49%. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Donald Trump is at 49.63 if you want to get exact, and
So
Harris
tight.
at 49.57. So it is very tight in Arizona. Maricopa County, of course, a big county that we're watching. That's where the city of Phoenix is, and I believe that about 60% of all the voters live right there in Maricopa County. So that's obviously a very
It's
important
very
battleground
tight.
state.
And
Hmm?
again, they must have faster counters there because their polls
Yeah.
closed after Minneapolis and St. Paul, but we've seen no numbers out of Minneapolis and St. Paul. Arizona is super tight. And what I will tell you from not only my travels there, but some of the things I've looked into there, people I know there, it has been a really interesting progression to see what's happened in the state of Arizona. I think when we think about Arizona, we think about Senator John McCain. And I think a lot of us think that, that state is tightly red, but we've seen a lot of variance depending on certain issues, other issues that came out of the 2020 election in Arizona. So I'm not surprised it's close. And I would believe that the election judges and just the Secretary of State there wants no question coming forth, no court cases and no questions about the count out of Arizona. So I'm glad they're being diligent. I'm glad they are getting the numbers in. And that's definitely an interesting one to watch tonight, Tom.
It absolutely is. And yeah, they had a hard time, I know, in Maricopa County specifically back in 2022 as well for the midterms. North Carolina, just, about a half hour ago, there was a wider lead between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, and now it's narrowed a bit. Donald Trump at 50.77% to Kamala Harris's 48.12%. And I would assume that that's because they're starting to tally up the numbers in the Charlotte area, maybe the Raleigh area as well, which are more, of course, liberal leaning and blue leaning areas of the state. So that's about 85% of the votes coming in. So that's a very tight race. Georgia, very tight as well. 90% counted, 51 to Trump, 48 to Harris. What do you make of the state of Georgia?
Yeah, well, some places are already calling Georgia for Trump. I think it's interesting. I like hearing what you're saying about 85, 87% percentages being counted or at least accounted for. I am a strong believer in waiting until, if possible, 75% or more. I mean, sometimes it's
Right.
early in the night, you say 20 to 30%, but let's be as ironclad as possible. I'd love it if, there are probably people already in bed. I don't know why, but I'll stay up tonight. But it would be wonderful if 90 some percent, maybe even 99% of the vote gets counted tonight so that when we're waking up on November 6th, there's not some big question mark. It's pretty darn clear, maybe a state or two or a county or two, but we should have that in because look, there were so many early ballots turned in. I think that we're going to find record numbers of early ballots. And so they were in. Granted, they're not supposed to be counted until election day, but they were in. So you've got them. You've got the judges already working on those things right away as the polls are closing. So I wanted to also share with you, Tom, I looked up the futures markets for you.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
This is an interesting thing. And the futures market, so this is like happening now. The Dow is up over 1,000 points. Bitcoin is at an all-new all-time high, so an all-time high. And what that says is that what the futures markets are saying, according to my interpreter, is that Donald Trump is going to win this election. We
Yes.
shall see. But that's what the futures markets are saying. If for those of your viewers out there who are into those numbers and looking at what the markets do, and a lot of times, that's what's happened. Now, bad news that the futures markets are also predicting is possible war if Donald Trump wins. So these are the things we have to balance and hopefully discern and hopefully keep our heads level no matter what happens after all the
What's
votes
your
are in.
analysis on that? If Donald Trump wins, there may be a possible war. Why is that the belief? Do you understand their thinking behind that?
Well, I will tell you my theory in hearing that prediction. My theory, and I've mentioned with you how some votes for Kamala Harris are not really votes for her. Many are votes against Donald Trump because there
Mm-hmm.
seems to be pure hatred for Donald Trump. Now,
Yes.
there might be people out there who have pure hatred for Kamala Harris, but there's an argument to be made that we don't know enough about Kamala Harris. Some would say we don't, to really have that kind of level of hatred that many have for Donald Trump. So, based on who our allies and enemies are in the world, if Donald Trump does win, and there are enough forces out there in play, again, it's not only international sources, but are there national sources that don't want a successful Trump second presidency? So again, this is me speaking solely for Rashini
Mm-hmm.
as a strategist, as someone who future casts for my clients, for the kinds of strategic messaging and work they're doing, and thinking about how to operate and function for business growth. So this is the thing. This is why you've heard me call the Constitution the good book. If we go back to the good book, the Constitution gave each person one vote. Those votes are being exercised today or tonight, being counted now across the country. And hopefully all Americans who voted can live with those results. And the ones who didn't vote and are of voting age and US citizens really, in my mind, don't have an opinion. Shouldn't count. Your opinion shouldn't count because you didn't vote. So I'm pretty strong in my belief about the strength of the Constitution. If we could all just read it, study it, and welcome it back into our psyches. Hopefully, something like a World War III would not happen. But that's my analysis of this prediction.
Yeah, it's strange to me. I mean, yeah, the Constitution is absolutely, we have to support it entirely. And we talked earlier about the three branches of government and why that's important, and the individual civil liberties for every single American, and why their rights matter. The war thing, it seems to me that the opposite would be true, just from what I've been watching with him. And I understand people say that they're worried about him taking us into World War III, but you analyze the past 3.5 years, what's happened, and they were saying the same thing back in 2016. If Donald Trump gets elected, it ended up being a safer world as a
And
result of
Tom,
what he
I,
did.
I I agree with that piece of it. Here's my point. I don't know that it's Donald Trump who would be taking us into war. It would be some of the forces that are not happy if he were to win the election,
Yeah,
both external
I think
forces and
Iran.
internal
Yeah,
forces.
Iran is not going to be happy if he wins, and I think there'll be some. Yeah, there could be some type of shot across the bow at the very best if he wins. But I think Donald Trump. You're right. I mean, Donald Trump is not going to back down to a fight. So maybe that's something that we would see ourselves getting into. We're kind of in it right now, but not fully. So that's a big concern. Hopefully that doesn't happen. But it is very interesting when you look at Bitcoin hitting a new record and all of this, and the Dow futures jumping over 500 points based on the idea that they believe Donald Trump's going to win this election. It's very interesting. Another little good factoid from Rashini Rajkumar. Rashini is so good to talk to you, as always. You can catch her, by the way, on the Crisis Files podcast. She is a messaging strategist, a brilliant attorney, and a journalist as well. And of course, a great podcast host too. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Good to see you.
Thanks, Tom.
All right. Take care. All right. We're going to get an update real quick on some of these states as well as they're coming in. Again, we're about to hit 11 o'clock. And 11 o'clock Eastern time means California is going to close and all these states on the West Coast. And we'll begin some new numbers in as well. I am very interested in what's happening right now in North Carolina. Is still standing with about 85% in. Donald Trump leading the state of North Carolina 50% to Kamala Harris's 48%. It's still a good enough margin, but they're not quite there yet. At least Fox News, from what I'm seeing, is not yet calling that particular race. Virginia, there was a scenario there where Trump was ahead, but now Kamala Harris 49%, 42%, I'm sorry, about 50% to Donald Trump's 48% in the state of Virginia. Pennsylvania, very interesting there. 50 Donald Trump, 48 Kamala Harris, with 65% of the vote being counted. All right, in a moment, we're going to talk to a very good friend of mine who I've known now for many, many years. He's one of the original news directors in television news, and he's been analyzing the campaigns from Donald Trump and Kamala Harris and these national races for quite some time. Great experience in the news business in New York, Detroit, Los Angeles, and San Diego, which is where I met him, but notorious news director. He's going to join me in a minute. His name is Steve Cohen. He's also an author of many books. But before that, I want to play again the first clip, Cameron, if you get that ready, that Donald Trump, when he spoke to the crowd in Grand Rapids, Michigan last night, his final stop, without a teleprompter, spoke from his heart about what he was thinking about the state of Michigan.
The progress that this party has made is incredible. It's very inclusive. It's inclusive of everybody, including our great mayor right back there. That is our great mayor, and who came through for us. But I want to thank everybody, and a very special hello to Michigan. We're going to do some great things from Michigan. We're going to do great things from Michigan. We're going to bring the car business blazing back. You're not going to remember what was like. We're going to make Detroit. We're going to make Detroit greater than it ever was. I've been hearing about Detroit for a long time. They've been talking about that miracle in Detroit. Well, I mean, look, we got to be honest. It hasn't happened, but it's going to happen now. It's going to happen, and at levels that you never dreamt possible. So for the auto workers who have been so incredible, you've been so incredible. You're going to be very happy with the things we're doing. We killed the plant, as you know, in Mexico. The biggest plant in the world was going to be built in Mexico, and I absolutely killed it. But I'd like to begin by asking a question. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Because over the past 4 years, Americans have suffered one catastrophic failure, betrayal, and humiliation after another. Kamala has delivered soaring prices and true economic anguish at home, war and chaos abroad, and a nation-destroying invasion on our southern border, invasion of some of the greatest criminals in the world that are pouring into our country. And we're not going to take that. We're going to end that, like, immediately. And I happen to think it's bigger than the economy. And I think, you know, every poll shows the economy and inflation and then the border and the horrible things that are going on. And I don't agree with it. I think we have to focus on all of it. We do it all one time. But to me, when you allow thousands of murderers into our country, to me, when you allowed the drug kingpins of the world into our, and terrorists into our country at levels that we've never seen before, to me, that's the bigger problem. We're going to solve it all, but that's the bigger problem. And we're going to have it taken care of very quickly. But my message to you and to all Americans tonight is very simple. We do not have to live this way. We don't have to live this way. We're not living good. 4 years, what did they do that was good? Can you name one thing? I said to a group of people, what have they done? Everything's a disaster, including nobody even knows how to. Supposing President Xi of China wanted to call to ask a little question about war or Taiwan or anything, who the hell does he call? We got a little problem in America. There's nobody to call. You know, they'll probably end up calling me. Maybe they'll call me. But, no. But who do you call? And remember, they ripped that presidency away from Joe Biden. Say what you want. We're not fans of Joe Biden. You know, I spent $150 million on him. We went through the convention. We never mentioned Kamala. Nobody knew who the hell she was. And all of a sudden, they picked Kamala, even though she was in last place. She came in number 13. They had 12 plus Kamala. She was considered the 13th. But then they wanted to be politically correct, so they picked Kamala. And they called her Harris, and nobody knew who Harris was. Like, call Harris. Who's Harris? Weird. You know, it's a very nice name, but it's a strange name because nobody knows who she is as Harris, so we have to call her Kamala. But she was the least popular. She got no votes. She lost in the primaries to Joe Biden and everybody else. She was the first one out. She quit the first one, 22 people. She left. She never made it to the great state of Iowa, never made it. And now we're running against her. But she's been exposed, you know, she's been exposed. She's a radical left lunatic who destroyed San Francisco. But we don't have to settle for weakness and incompetence and decline and decay. That's a nice word, decay. That's what's happened. That's a nice word, decay. Can you imagine? And nobody will question it because it's true. With your vote tomorrow, we can fix every single problem our country faces and lead America, indeed the world, to new heights of glory. Think of that statement, how beautiful that is. New heights of glory, that's what's going to happen. When we win the election and we're really well, look, the ball's in our hand. All we have to do is get out the vote tomorrow. You get out the vote, they can't do anything about it, we win. One of their top people just got on television. I was coming in and they said, these are not looking good, these numbers for them. This is very troubling. At least he was honest. No, all we have to do, if we get out our people, it's over. There's nothing they can do about it. It's nice when you have that, right? You know? In other words, to make you feel a little guilty, we would only have you to blame. But we put ourselves in an unusual position. Never happened where we're leading by hundreds of thousands of votes. in the early stage vote. That's never happened before. We've always been losing by sometimes millions of votes, and you keep catching them on Tuesday, but Tuesday comes along and you make it, or you don't quite make it, you're a little short, and then they cheat, and it makes it a little tougher. Because when you have open borders, transgender everything, high taxes, very high taxes, they're campaigning on the fact that they're going to raise everybody's taxes, and you have men playing in women's sports. You have to cheat. Who the hell is going to approve that stuff? Who's going to approve open borders with criminals pouring into our country by the millions? No, they have to cheat. They have to cheat, and they do it very well, actually. But I think we're in very good shape. We just have to show up, and you're going to have the biggest victory. You know what this will be? The single greatest victory, politically speaking, in the history of our country.
Yeah, Donald Trump last night, Grand Rapids, Michigan, again, his last stop on his campaign, which he did again in 2016 when he won that, and he brought that up last night, and it actually carried on after midnight as well, and he spoke at length, and he didn't get back home till, I think, Mar-a-Lago until 5 o'clock in the morning, and that was his fourth rally yesterday on the final day of his campaign. So we look at Michigan right now, and we're looking at Donald Trump ahead. Again, with only 28% of the votes being reported at this point, which likely means it's not including Wayne County, which of course is a Democratic stronghold, and maybe some other ones as well. We're looking at Saginaw too, Saginaw County, Kent County, and up in Grand Traverse County as well. Those are kind of bellwethers of how the entire state is going to go. Saginaw being a big one, because I think since 2008, Saginaw County has always gone with the winner of the presidential election, starting with Barack Obama in 2008. All right, but right now it's Donald Trump at 51% to Kamala Harris's 46% in the great state of Michigan. Somebody who used to live in Michigan a while back and has been out in California for a number of years now, Steve Cohen, used to be a major newsman here at WXYZ back in the day, in the Bill Bonds days, and he joins me now. Steve, it's so good to have you on the program out there on the West Coast. How are you?
I'm great. It's just good to see you. You know, Tom, my years in Detroit, of course, were big years. You know, they were the years where there wasn't cable, there was no other place to go, so you went to Channel 7, and that was, you say, Jack Lickoff, Bill Bonds, John Kelly, Jerry Hodak, all those people. And my experience in the Michigan world in the mid 70s, of course, was just post Watergate. So I came in there, and Gerald Ford was then president of the United States before Jimmy Carter. So when you look at this election, and particularly in terms of Michigan, and there's just a sense of a mythology, I think, that's falling apart now. And the mythology was that people that lived in Dearborn who were of Arab descent would not be in favor of Donald Trump, that Hispanic men would not be in favor of Donald Trump, that women would not vote for Trump. And you put all those I call them mythologies because they're sensed on the idea that there's a monolith that these groups are. And of course, there is no monolith, right? And then you have American Jews, of course, again, large Jewish population in the Detroit, Michigan area. So you look at the entire state of Michigan and you say, one other thing, will rural turn up for Trump? And the answer is, in the rest of the country, as of right now, rural is really turning out for Trump, and urban is not turning out with the same intensity as Kamala needs, right? So I think you're sitting there right at the hub of sort of the breakup of what I'm going to call the Obama coalition, or the Obama methodology of how you approach a campaign. It looks like Donald Trump has blown that to smithereens.
And good for him, because I think you're spot on. I was out working in your newsroom when Barack Obama came to office back in 2008, and his tactics were so different. He was a community organizer. So the way he operated was to pit groups of individuals against one another. And he did that through identity politics in 2008 and again in 2012. And we've adopted that kind of methodology in our political landscape. identity politics now is the way that the Democrats have been running the race. And to me, I think you just touched on the salient point here. When you're talking about the Jewish population primarily going towards the Democratic candidates, historically speaking, in the past, many election
Yeah.
cycles. Same with the Arab Americans or the Muslim voters. You talk about the African American voters as well, the Hispanic vote. All these identities that they've identified as some, as you so eloquently said, a monolithic group of people. I think they're starting to wake up, especially when you see what has been happening in Israel. When you talk about the Jewish, this is very interesting here because the American Jews and the Muslim Americans have both been supportive of the Democratic Party. Now, both of those groups are angry at the Democratic Party for different reasons, but directly related to what's happening in the state of Israel right now, ever since
And I think
October
that,
7th of
and I
2023.
think, and I
Go
think
ahead.
what's changed politically in the years that I've been involved with this, since my first presidential election was 1974 when Richard Nixon won. What's changed is that while we identify with specific groups, we still see ourselves of having unified needs. And Donald Trump in this election cycle was able to dip into the unified needs like groceries, inflation, housing costs, and of course, immigration. And then when you go to the international sphere, you say, well, does a country like Israel have a right to defend itself against neighbors that are out to destroy it? The answer is yes. So when you put all those things together into one bin, which is the American melting pot, the idea of identity politics begins to break apart. And Trump somehow figured that out. And of course, Trump is Trump, but I'm talking about policy and the ethos that America now has, which is we really are one nation with similar values and similar concerns. And the Democrats represent the few, the elites, the identity groups. And we don't want America to be defined by the minority telling the majority what to do. We want to get back to majority rule while guaranteeing constitutional minority rights. That's the shift, my friend.
That's exactly it. It's a very important. I mean, we go back to like the Articles of Confederation, and what they figured out was that a pure
Yeah.
democracy doesn't work because, while majority rules, that actually ends up treading upon the individual rights of these Americans who have equal rights as the majority does. So they institute the Constitution for those very reasons, and we seem to be stripping a lot of that away. Do you think, from a journalist perspective, that today's journalists understand that history of this country, what made it work in the first place, the fact that the importance of the Constitution? Because from my perspective, I see a lot of reporters out there saying, no, the Constitution is itself inherently racist and needs to be done away with.
I think we're in a media environment that is defined by ignorance. I've never watched more media outlets where they celebrate their ignorance and don't apologize for it. It used to be that we all had to have some thought about what we were doing. We studied things, we knew things, and we carried that as part of a badge of courage that we wore in our sleeves. Today, that doesn't matter. Historical reference point, understanding of history, and most importantly, this idea of being what I call an honest broker. Our goal, yours and mine, through our careers has been I am an honest broker. That doesn't mean that I don't personally have a viewpoint, but it does mean that I will accept my personal bias, but I am going to present myself as an honest broker. And that has gone away. There are so few honest brokers that you can find in mainstream media. The result of that, you look at the ABC debate. That's a good example. CNN debate. You name it. And then if you add up what, and I just saw this report this morning, where agencies had looked at Google and the percentage of positive stories versus negative over the course of the campaign. You know what the result is.
Oh, yeah.
That the majority of the stories have been negative about Trump and positive for Harris. And here's the problem. When you don't act as an honest broker, the truth comes through eventually. And you cannot look at this night and believe that most Americans thought that Kamala Harris was a good choice to be president of the United States. That's, again, the mythology that was created by the DNC to surround Ms. Harris so that she would appear to be presidential. When Americans, even people that are supposed to be supporting her tonight, are not supporting her in urban areas. Why? Because you can't take a bad product and sell it at the store like it's a premier product. That just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, they can see
Americans
right
are
through
too
it.
smart for that. Do you buy
Yeah,
that, Tom?
yeah, they're not buying into the disingenuousness of the Kamala Harris candidacy. And I had a conversation with my daughter, and we don't talk a lot about politics. One
Yeah.
of my kids, but I said, what do you think of Kamala Harris? And she looked at me and she says, "Oh, she's ridiculous. She can't even answer a question. She's not
Right.
real." And the authenticity of a character is just it needs to be there, because you can fool people for a short time, but after a while, it gets revealed who you really are. So, to that point, you look at these various states, and I'm still shocked that it's this close,
Yeah.
this race between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And it just, to me, it speaks about the hatred of Donald Trump more than the fact that people like Kamala Harris. But it is still very close. You look at Arizona, which is, just east of where you're sitting at now in San Diego, California. It's tied up. They got about 50% reporting right now. Trump at 49% and Kamala Harris
Yeah.
in 49% as well. That's in the state of Arizona, one of the battlegrounds that we're watching pretty closely. I'm not sure if that's including Maricopa County as of yet, but how do you see that shaping up?
Well, I think that, again, if you listen to mainstream media, you get the feeling that Kari Lake has no shot at being senator, and that
Mhm.
Arizona and Nevada will never go for Trump. But when you get right down to it, you can see that the electorate wasn't buying what mainstream media was selling. And the result of that is that we all going in tonight thinking that it's going to be one thing and it's another thing. The reason it's another thing is because no one told us the truth. I mean, we can be fooled. We're just people. If you own Hollywood, you own media, right? And you own music, you can pretty much develop a cultural message that was the only thing that people are going to hear. Guess what happened? When Joe Biden stepped aside, those elements, again, media, Hollywood, music, they all came together to get, Taylor Swift, you name it. Even Harrison Ford yesterday at 82 is coming out for Harris. You go, what's up with that? Where's the other message? Where's the other side? Didn't exist. Tonight, the people were waiting in line, right, to vote. And guess what was happening? On their phones, they had superstars that were telling them to stand in line and don't give up for Harris. Can you
Hmm.
believe that?
Wow.
So,
Yeah.
and then social media. Forget social media. I can't even talk about it. I mean, that's just uncontrolled. The guys that run Google, Zuckerberg, and all these other people. Somebody needs to come after them for what they're doing. They've used the rule called Section 230, which means they have no liability for whatever is said on their platforms. No
Right.
liability. Like, oh, well, we don't care. Oh, yeah, well, you do care. All you have to do is size up how much negative or positive you gave to the two campaigns. So if you put those factors together, you can sell the American people whatever you want. But at
They-
the end of the day, we know what a steak is and when it isn't.
yeah.
And they've been selling us hamburger and pretending it's steak, and she ain't a steak.
That's right on. Yeah, so when my mother tried to pass off a tofu burger on my plate when I was 12 years old in California, I said, "That's not a hamburger." She said, "Tommy, that's a hamburger." I said, "That is not a hamburger, Mom." And it's the same thing. At least I was wise enough at 12 years old not to eat the tofu burger
I,
that she was
I'm,
trying to
I, you
pass.
know, I'm okay with my analogy, Tom. I mean, I know it's sort of old school, but
Yeah.
don't
Hey,
don't give me hamburger and don't tell me it's steak. And I don't
right.
care how much media and Hollywood and concerts you have. You can't change the fundamentals of a person's ability to deal with issues and concerns and depth.
Mm.
God bless Miss Harris for everything she's done in her life. It's an extraordinary life. There's just no question about it. But one thing she has never really done is attach herself to study, to being studious, to understanding policy. And that does not make for a good president. Now, you cannot like Donald Trump's view of any of these things, but he's a student of it.
He
And I
certainly
think
is.
and I think
Yeah.
American people are doing it. Now, look, it's a little too early to know where this is all going to turn out. Look, I think Pennsylvania is going to go not just into tomorrow morning. I think we don't know about Pennsylvania probably until the end of the week.
Yeah. It
But
might be a ways.
I think he's going to be pretty close. I think he's going to be close to 270 when we end tonight, sometime two in the
The
morning
interesting
or
thing
something.
about Pennsylvania right now, they've got about 70% of this counted, which was surprising to me when I saw those numbers. And I'm with you. I've been saying that Pennsylvania might be a couple of days, and we're going to need to know it might come down to that state. But right now in Pennsylvania, Donald Trump is up 51 to Kamala Harris is 48%. So there's still, it depends on which counties these are in. I mean, Kamala Harris could
How
come
much
back.
reporting there? What's in Pennsylvania right now? What's it up to? What's the
Uh,
percentage of voting in?
Pennsylvania, so yeah, I mean the count it's been 75% in
Wow.
Pennsylvania, and it's 51% Trump, 48% Harris. So he's ahead
Wow.
by about just over 3% in Pennsylvania, and it's about 75%. Surprisingly, I was with
You
you.
know,
I thought that
The Senate race there, the Republican who's quite a candidate, West Point graduate, uh, combat veteran, etc., that he could beat Bob Casey, who's been the senator there for many years. I knew Bob's father, who was the governor of the state.
you're
But
talking about McCormick.
McCormick,
Right
I
now
mean,
McCormick is ahead.
McCormick could win.
Yeah, he's ahead right now, 49.5 to 47.9 over Casey. So something's
Yeah, so
happening in
that's
Pennsylvania.
another thing. I think we could be up as many as two, maybe even three senators in terms of the balance of power in the Senate Republican, which would really give President Trump an opportunity to really get some things done. The House is also running pretty well. What do you think about Michigan? Where do you think it's going through the
Well,
night?
I think it's Michigan. People have called it a purple state, and I say this is such a far leftist blue state now, and it has been for a
Really?
few years. When I left California, I sat in your office, and it was one of the hardest things I've had to do in my professional career was to move out of San Diego in a station that I loved to move, but I did it because the politics in California had a real real life impact on my life. And
Yes.
we had to move out to Michigan, which we love the state of Michigan. It's a beautiful place. Don't get me wrong. But what's happened in the interim in the past 12 years, it's hard to believe it's been that long, almost 12 years, that Michigan has wanted so desperately to become like California. And so we have a governor here who loves Gavin Newsom. Gretchen Whitmer and Gavin Newsom are tied. They're one and the same. And it's
Well,
becoming
but
fascinating.
don't you think this election though sheds a light on the so-called California experiment? I mean,
Yes.
Harris is part of the experiment, and the experiment's
Yes.
failed. We're looking at 68 or to 72 billion dollars in debt right
Yeah.
now that the state is carrying. Uh, we've got
Well,
another gubernatorial race coming up in 2026, and most of the folks that are running are more progressive liberals.
yeah.
So I think Whitmer could have chosen another pathway, but she didn't.
She did. I think she's made more than a tactical error. I think she's ruined a lot of lives by going the route she's done, but it is a tactical error. And she said 2 years ago that if she wins the House and the Senate in the state of Michigan, that she's going to put her foot on the accelerator to make it as far left blue as she possibly can. That's what she's been doing. But in the interim, a lot of people have been suffering through it. So now I'm looking at the latest numbers here in Michigan, and this is with about 32% reporting. Trump is up 52% to Kamala Harris now 46. So the gap is widening between these two candidates. And I do think a lot of Michiganders, Michiganians, whatever you want to call them, are
Yeah.
smart. And they're seeing what's happened. We have enough case studies, and we could just look to your state there in California, but you could look at Oregon, you could look at Washington, you look at Minnesota, and see what's been happening over the last few years in these states. Illinois, another one. Crime is through the roof. The cost of living is horrendous. Taxes are up. And it's in a very oppressive regime, essentially. In this, you look at COVID, what happened during COVID in these blue states. It's very
And look,
authoritarianism in the way they operated them. And I think
yeah, and
Michiganders
look,
are waking up to that.
and that's not the Michigan that has to be, as you know. I mean, when I was in Michigan, Henry Ford II had just finished the Renaissance Center, just finished it. Belle Isle was still one beautiful place to recreate and run around.
Yeah.
The city had not recovered from the riots of the 60s and the 70s, still had not
Mm.
recovered.
Yeah.
But Coleman Young gave it a shot. I mean, he really came in and said, let's take a step in the right direction and worked on it. And also, life in the suburbs of Michigan, Bloomfield Hills, north, outside of 10 Mile Road and going north.
Yeah.
What a great place to live. I mean,
Yes.
you just could not ask for a better place. But like San Diego County, what became sort of a deep red conservative place that was making progress turned the color of blue, and then far blue and dark blue. And that's not the state of Michigan. I mean, I know the people of Michigan. I've recreated there. I love it there. And in a lot of ways, once you get outside of Detroit proper, Michigan is like any other rural state, more like my home state of Pennsylvania.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
It feels more like, but the difference is Pennsylvania has more balanced electorate and a better sense of what regular people need. And Whitmer has taken Detroit into the identity politics and special interest world, which is a bad place for Michigan over the long term, in my view.
And in my view as well, and I think people are waking up that it's in their view also. And I think this is going to turn. I'm actually going to say, I'm not calling this officially, but in my view, I think that Michigan is going to win this for Donald Trump. I think that's the way it's going right now. And I think the sentiment is out here that they're just kind of tired of the Gretchen Whitmer, Jocelyn Benson, Dana Nessel ways of doing business here in Michigan, and it's time for a change. So we'll find out. I would love to see you back here at some point, but I'll be back.
Sure, happy to do it.
Visiting you in San Diego very soon, and we'll stay in touch. Steve Cohen, and one of the best newsmen ever in the history of journalism, is broadcast journalism, and you've got a bunch of great books that you've written. People should check it out. What was the latest book you wrote? Is about the TV news.
I have two memoirs out, which is one is The News Life from Arkansas to Aruba, and the new one is called 50 Years in a Newsroom, a Eulogy. So it's sort of my it's sort of my memorial to what news used to be and what it is today.
Yeah, it's a great book. So much appreciated. Steve Cohen, a good friend and just a giant in the industry. Thanks so much, Steve. Good to talk to you.
We'll catch up later in the week. Thanks, Tom.
Sounds good. Steve Cohen. He's one of my heroes. It was difficult to leave his newsroom when I did back in 2012, 2013, early 2013. But it was a result of the fact that politics matter. Elections do matter. They have consequences, and it affects everyday citizens like you and me. So that's why I'm so interested in this one. I want to bring back in Rob Johnson, the CEO of Wayne Radio, who's does all the magic here, and Tom Jordan Live. And listen, you've been watching the election results tonight, and you're getting a sense. Are you seeing the patterns now kind of developing across this country?
Yeah, we've been having a lot of fun out there. I don't know if the listeners can hear it from 3 rooms over, but there's a raucous crowd out there.
Yes.
So it's really interesting to see how this is laid out over the last 2 hours specifically. It's looking like Georgia's going to be called, and the decision desk, excuse me, HQ has already called Georgia for Trump, but a lot of other networks have not yet. So. That's really interesting. And then Arizona, slim margin there. And then the blue wall is all currently reporting in red. So it's a really unique race in Minnesota still. Under minority votes have been counted, but still also leaning red. So just a really interesting night thus far.
It is interesting. I mean, it could end up being. I mean, if the trend continues the way it is right now, and you look at some of these states, I mean, I know Virginia now has kind of gone back to Kamala Harris's column a little bit back and forth in that. But North Carolina, we got Donald Trump. And if we get Michigan, when I say we, I mean Donald Trump. I am biased. I know I am. But if he gets Wisconsin and Michigan and Minnesota, because Minnesota is now trending towards Donald Trump too, this could feasibly become a blowout.
It very well could be. I would caution, though. I know you're optimistic on Michigan. I'm not. I still think Michigan's going to stay blue. I know right now it's leading, but I don't know if you've ever seen the show Mad Men, but they're talking about the 1960 presidential election, and it's obviously Nixon and Kennedy, and one of the characters is very Republican, and he said Kennedy was up late finding every corpse in Cook County to to swing the vote. So you just never know how these things are going to play out. But right now, if you look at 2020, and where we were at 11:30 p.m. and where we're at right now,
Mm-hmm.
drastically different. And I think a big part of that is because people want a return to normalcy. And I think in 2020, obviously there was a tremendous events going on around the world. You had COVID, you had, the fallout from January 6th, and people wanted, a dose of, reasonableism. And for them, that was Joe Biden. I don't necessarily agree, but that's what it was. And I think that's where we're at right now is people want to turn from all of this craziness that we're seeing, largely coming from the left. And it's showing currently in the polls, not just at the top of the ticket, but all the way down the ticket as well.
Yeah, so you brought up 2020. We were watching a number of races, but yeah, something switched. I remember I came into work. I was working very early in the morning back in 2020, and election night, went to bed, got up, and it looked like it was in favor of Donald Trump at that point. And some of these Senate races too. We talked about John James going up against Gary Peters in that Senate race, and John James was ahead even at 3:30 in the morning, and then it started to switch back the other way. And you see some of these numbers coming in from Wayne County, which is where Detroit sits, and Dearborn, and most of it is blue. Most of it is a Democratic stronghold. And so I think right now that's probably what's happening. You're probably wise to say, hold off, hold your horses just a little bit there. And that might be the case, but it's still, to me, this is a pretty big gap of 7 points between Kamala Harris and Trump in the state of Michigan. But we will wait and see. It's only 34% being counted.
Yeah, it's big. And then the other two things I'm looking at right now is the betting market. Currently 92% in favor of Donald Trump, which is tremendously high.
Isn't that amazing?
It's wild. It's, it's almost teetering on the point of in 2016 where, Hillary called and conceded the election when it, tipped to 95 on the betting average.
Is that what it was in 2016?
That was a part of it. It wasn't the only thing, but that was, at that point, she started off, I believe, at 65% going into the election. And then to flip the other way where she went from 65 to 5 in 5 hours, it's quite interesting. The crypto market's currently up. There's a lot of indicators right now of the direction this is heading in. And one thing too that I want to draw your attention to is Pennsylvania. So the last I looked, and I've been sitting here for about 10 minutes, but Philadelphia was, I believe, 70% in, and there was, I believe, roughly 200,000 votes left outstanding, and they were going 3-1 Democrat. So looking at that, and then Pittsburgh was 90% in, it's almost statistically impossible for Trump to lose Pennsylvania right now, given the current margins. It's still, it would have to be the worst case scenario throughout for him to lose currently. But statistically, Pennsylvania is very well in his favor right now.
Well, you're looking at some of these various House races as well. The Associated Press calling a number of districts for Republicans in the state of Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And again, in that state, there are many and plenty of Republican and conservative strongholds too, county by county. But the vast majority of them are going towards, and these are the state houses.
Yeah.
You look at the state house and the state senate in Pennsylvania. But I am surprised at how quickly they seem to be counting in the state of Pennsylvania, because it's 77% right now reporting. And I was looking at maybe this might be taking a couple days in that state. Maybe they're becoming more efficient in that. But as it stands now, Donald Trump at 51% to Kamala Harris's 48%. So it's about just over 3 percentage points between these two.
And how many are in right now?
It was 77%.
77. Okay.
77%. So it still could change, but it depends on how much you got in Philadelphia, as you mentioned, 3-1. You said,
right?
Was it?
Yeah. I think there's roughly 200,000 left outstanding, and they're bending 3-1 Democrat right now. So with that, he had, a 3% lead with 75% of the vote in when I last looked. So it'd be very difficult for him to lose Pennsylvania at this point.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're right. So you got Philadelphia County, which is 77, Harris to Donald Trump's 21%. That's 70% in, and then you got Bucks County, which is tied really. Kamala Harris winning by just a fraction of a percent in that region. All kind of close together, kind of. Montgomery is another one that's favoring Kamala Harris. So we'll watch that. But if we get Donald Trump, I keep saying we. If Donald Trump gets Pennsylvania.
Tom's going to be in his cabinet. He hasn't told everyone yet. That's
press secretary for Donald Trump. All right, so that's that. You look at Arizona, those numbers are kind of.
It's close.
It's very close.
3,000 votes last I checked.
Okay, so what do you make of that? Because the polls showed that Donald Trump had a bit of a higher gap. There's a bigger margin between these two candidates. And Maricopa, of course, is the big county there. 60% of the voters, I think, reside in Maricopa County. But what do you think is happening in Arizona?
I just don't think all the votes are in. I think it's still under 50% last I checked. So there's not a whole lot there. It's a 3% margin currently. So, or 3,000 vote rather gap between the two of them. The last I checked, that was about 1118. So, so right now it's just not enough has come in to see, who's gaining and who's not. And Nevada hasn't even reported yet either. So
no, I'm very curious about Nevada. I mean, there's 0% reporting. I am also curious about Georgia because they got 91%. And you touched on this earlier, but they're not calling it yet.
Oh, some
Georgia.
people have, some haven't. So right now it's split across. Decision Desk has called it. A lot of the major networks have not. The AP hasn't called it, but AP has historically been slower on the draw. I would expect Fox is going to call it within the hour here.
Yeah, and probably the same with North Carolina. They got about 90% in as well. Trump ahead by 2 points in North Carolina.
Yep.
So we'll find out. I know he's slipping in Virginia. Trump is to Kamala Harris is 50 to 47.
Yes, and one thing I wanted to bring up too, and this was interesting. The last we talked about New Hampshire, Trump had a 10-point drop. It's now eased to 4 points, and there's, I believe, 35% of the vote left outstanding. That's interesting to me, and that's why I said New Hampshire is a potential swing state.
It's interesting because Fox News has called New Hampshire for Kamala Harris.
Oh, that must be really recent because I checked probably 10, 15 minutes ago before we sat down here. So,
but they've only got 71% of the votes counted.
It must
and
be
it's
that
about a
there's
2.5 point, about 3 point difference.
It must be there's Democrat counties left outstanding then. So that's probably, it's one of those things where I thought it'd be a swing state, but what do I know?
Well, you know a lot, actually. It's very, very close in New Hampshire, and I still thought most of it was a little bit more conservative than it really is. So
when I saw it go from 10 to 4 within like a 10% vote intake, I was like, oh, well, this is it. It's not.
So, okay, go back to the betting markets because this is fascinating to me. You watch them more than I. In fact, I paid no attention to the betting markets other than the fact that I know prior to today, I think it was like, 60% for Trump or like 30 to 40% of Kamala Harris is kind of about where it was. But I didn't go granular into the betting markets. But how accurate are they when you compare them to the polls that we all pay attention to?
It's like anything else. It's right. It's a proposition based on probabilities, and probabilities take into account exit polling, the national polls, local aggregates. There's just so many different factors that go into the betting markets. But what's interesting is as it continues to tick up and up, there's more variables than just what we're seeing on the raw vote count. It's, exit polls and how people are responding to that. And even, looking at, Trump's margin with, Latino voters, like there's just a lot there that is interesting as this is coming out, and this is all tipping in his favor. And the last I checked, it was like 92%.
Yeah, wow.
And right now, like if you really think Kamala's going to win, bet some money on her right now because being a 8% favorite right now is
make a lot of money. If
absolutely.
She does. So you mentioned that Bitcoin's up, Dow futures have jumped over 500 points already because they are believing that Donald Trump is going to win this election. So that tells you, what does that tell you from a business perspective? That the markets are going up based on the fact that they believe Donald Trump's going to win.
Yeah, I think anytime there's a Republican, stronghold in, the branches of government, what you're looking at is the economy is perceived to do more favorably because there's less regulation, there's more of a pro-business mindset, and institutions respond well to that. They have optimism around that. Whereas with Democrats, you're looking at more legislation, more regulation. I would say they're not as pro-business as Republicans historically. And I can give you an excellent case study from 2020, during COVID and what Democratic governors were doing.
Oh my gosh.
To cripple businesses during that time. So there's just so many different variables to that. But overall, if you look at the last 40 years of general elections, the markets favor Republican presidents when they become president-elect, and that's what we're looking at right now.
Here's what Democratic governors did in 2020, and this is me talking, not you, but I'll just say they killed the economy in their various states, and then they said they blamed Donald Trump during this election cycle, saying, hey, we lost so many jobs in Michigan when Donald Trump was president. Yes, because we have a Democratic governor who shut down and punished businesses that tried to reopen. Anyway, that's just an aside. If people don't remember back in 2020, I do very clearly about what happened back then. All right, any final thoughts before we head on out?
Yeah, so I would say for me, this is an excellent lesson for people on the left. And if this goes the way that it's looking like it's going, this really serves as a reminder that, if you have these, demonstrably radical ideas that are, so far out of the norm, they're not going to be adopted large scale throughout the country. And this election, up and down the ticket is a testament to that. If you want to win in the United States moving forward, you need to be more moderate. You need to be a unifier. You cannot be someone who is, trying to carve off a small subset of the party and claiming that that's the majority thought of the country, and it's not. And that's what the left is largely doing right now. And it's super transparent, and voters see through it, and that's what we're seeing right now. And I'm very happy about that because it's been a long time coming, and I hope this goes the way that it's looking right now.
Yeah, that's wise. You're right. There are some extreme positions that do not represent the vast majority of Americans' perception and perspectives on these various policies. We have time before we head on out to take a comment. I appreciate all your patience watching our coverage tonight of the returns. Charles Beatty, big thank you, Rob, for granting Tom the ability at Avenue to keeping us Michiganders informed. Thank you, Charles. Very nice to say.
That's super kind.
Yeah, thank you, Rob, for hiring me. That was a big help.
Easy decision, Tom.
In a time of need, and I appreciate it. And this is, by the way, the most fun I've had in my career. I love this. And I love the fact that people are continuing to watch the program. Tom Jordan Live, it's the beginning of a whole new maybe entity of Wayne Radio, and we're just going to keep growing and growing. And we thank you for paying attention to us. This is just the beginning. We'll be back, in fact, tomorrow morning going over some of these numbers on Tom Jordan Live. We'll be streaming live again at 9 a.m. right here on YouTube, X, Facebook, and again, it all lives on Spotify, Apple Podcasts as well. God bless you. We'll see what happens. Join us tomorrow morning. Have a good night.